Chapter 355. On that day in the desolate meadow, after their naked conversation, Hui Yen returned to the camp and locked himself in his residence. He did not come out for a whole 10 days. On the 11th day, Hui Yen, who looked like he had lost a lot of weight, found Lu Chen. In the dark priest's stone house, Hui Yen opened his mouth. He looked tired and a little pained, but more than that, he had an uncontrollable desire. "Tell me the method," he said. Lu Chen smiled in the dim shadows. Then, he took out the intact fire god's staff and threw it to Hui Yen. "The key lies in this." He smiled and looked satisfied. His whole person was gentle and polite. He did not look like a person who would plant the seeds of hatred in this tribe and lay the groundwork for the future bloody battles of the tribe. Did this man ever think of this? Hui Yen looked at the black-robed priest in silence, then looked at the fire god's staff in his hand. He slowly tightened his grip on it and closed his eyes. The Black Fire tribe, which had suddenly risen like a raging fire and swept across the northern part of the wilderness in the blink of an eye like a raging tide, was originally a mysterious tribe. Especially when their actions were gradually attracting the attention of the more powerful tribes in the south, the Black Fire tribe suddenly stopped in their tracks. There was almost no sign in between. The Black Fire tribe seemed to have become harmless all of a sudden, calmly staying in the northern part of the wilderness. This made the originally worried southern tribes heave a sigh of relief. From the reports of their spies, every piece of information showed that the Black Fire tribe seemed to be really satisfied. Their ambitions were limited to the barren northern land. They were in awe of the large tribes in the southern wilderness, as well as the many powerful shamans, venerables, and high priests of the war god temple. They even offered expensive gifts. Of course, what good things could there be in that barren wasteland? They didn't care about it at all. However, the chiefs were more interested in the Black Fire tribe's submissive attitude. In comparison, the war god temple, which stood at the top of the wasteland, wasn't interested in the small tribe that had just risen up in the north. However, after hearing that the tribe had risen because they had found a new high priest, one of the venerables in the war god temple seemed to have paid attention to this. He ordered a few high priests to go to the north to take a look and figure out the situation. At the same time, some people in the war god temple remembered that a rising priest of the temple had gone to the mountain spirit tribe in the north some time ago, but there was no news of him since then. It was said that the mountain spirit tribe had been destroyed in the war with the Black Fire tribe, and the priest had gone missing. The shamans and venerables didn't care about this matter, but there were still a few good friends of the priest in the war god temple. They secretly pushed for an investigation of what had happened. In short, during the period of the sudden rise of the Black Fire tribe, the world was still developing peacefully. As for the undercurrents under the calm, most people wouldn't know about it. Time passed day by day. The Black Fire tribe wasn't actually very peaceful. There were always many things happening every day. It wasn't easy for the few tribes that had been destroyed by the Black Fire tribe and the captives that were captured to integrate into the Black Fire tribe. They were resistant, and the people from the Black Fire tribe often didn't like them. In the most important aspect of faith, even though Lu Chen and Hui Yen had forcefully suppressed it from the beginning and forced the tribesmen to give up their faith in the god, it wasn't that easy. Therefore, they still found and captured many people who had secretly worshipped the god. Hui Yen didn't show them any mercy and killed them in front of the entire tribe. The blood shocked and frightened the people. This temporarily suppressed the matter, but there were still more troublesome things. The sudden rise of the Black Fire tribe had caused the ambition of the young and proud barbarian warriors of the tribe to soar. They had plundered a lot of wealth, women, and servants through the war of slaughtering the other tribes, but they still wanted more. They wanted to go south. They wanted to wield their blood-stained blades and rob the rich tribes in the south. Legend had it that the southern and southern regions were the real paradise, with mountains of gold and seas of silver, milk flowing everywhere, and beautiful women like immortals. Hui Yen had a headache dealing with these simple-minded fools. They were idiots, but he had to be clear-headed. Fortunately, these days, his prestige in the Black Fire tribe had risen. No one dared to openly defy him, so he managed to suppress the matter. However, similar disputes and requests would still pop up every 2 or 3 days, making him very annoyed. In contrast, Lu Chen's life was much more relaxed. He had never cared about these trivial matters of the Black Fire tribe. Even if it was his idea to capture captives, replenish the population of the Black Fire tribe, and force them to give up their faith, it was also his idea. But now, he seemed to have nothing to do with it, as if this matter had nothing to do with him. He was beginning to prepare for his return to the north. Coming to the southern wilderness was a complete accident for Lu Chen. He had no feelings for this vast land, nor did he have any sense of belonging to the barbarians here. He was like a passerby, coldly watching everything that happened here. Perhaps it was because of this mentality that the decisions he made in the process of helping Huiyen revive the Black Fire tribe were especially cold-blooded and unyielding. Perhaps he didn't care about the blood that was spilled and the people that died in the process. If he could, he even wanted to leave immediately. But of course, this matter couldn't be so casual. Huiyen and the Black Fire tribe still had many things that they needed his help with. The first was the problem of a new priest. And this would also take a long time. Fortunately, Lu Chen had already cultivated a patience that was hard to be matched by ordinary people in his past life as a shadow. Like the Black Fire tribe, he silently went into hiding and then did what he had to do, while waiting for Huiyen's decision. In the selection of a new priest, Huiyen had been very determined to reject outsiders, and insisted on only choosing his own children who were born in the Black Fire tribe. But this decision was quickly shaken after he learned the secret from Lu Chen. At the same time, Lu Chen also told him once again that there was no suitable candidate in the Black Fire tribe. This is impossible. That night, after confirming the news from Lu Chen, almost half of the Black Fire camp could hear the roar coming from the Dark Priest's stone house. But although they were angry, it didn't have much use. On the last piece of paper that Lu Chen handed over, Huiyen quickly fell into silence as he looked at the names written on it. Lu Chen sat down beside him and said, "In this tribe's camp, I found a total of 7 people who have the potential to be a priest. 1 from the Mountain Spirit tribe, 2 from the Sacred Wood tribe, and the most from the Thunder Lizard tribe, with 4. Lu Chen didn't say anything else, but his meaning was very clear. The rest would be decided by Huiyen. Huiyen was silent for a long time, then lowered his voice and said, "If this thing is made public, I'm afraid that the brothers of the Black Fire tribe will rebel. They might even raise their weapons and kill people." He raised his head to look at Lu Chen and said with a rare serious expression, "Is there really no one in the Black Fire tribe? Even if there is one, it will be enough." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "I can't find one." The muscles on Huiyen's face contorted as he stared at the piece of paper. Abruptly, his gaze froze as though he had discovered something. Furrowing his brows, he asked Lu Chen, "This person named Yi, could it be that she's your serving girl?" "Yes," Lu Chen replied. Chapter 356. In the end, Huiyen gave in on the matter of choosing a priest. Or perhaps it was not appropriate to say that, because neither Lu Chen nor Huiyen had a better choice. Huiyen did not want to believe that there was no one suitable to be a priest among so many people in his tribe, but the truth was right in front of him. At the same time, it once again dealt a heavy blow to his reverence for the fire god that his tribe worshipped. Therefore, in the following days, although this barbarian became more and more silent, his cooperation with Lu Chen became more and more tacit. The secret that Lu Chen told Huiyen was actually not complicated. Under the situation where the inheritance of the ancient priests of the Black Fire tribe was broken, the power of the Black Fire that appeared in the tribe was inherited through the fire god's staff. Lu Chen also went to the fire god's altar with Huiyen, and after obtaining the complete fire god's staff, he obtained the Black Fire witchcraft that had been passed down through the generations of the Black Fire tribe. And during this time, Lu Chen discovered a secret. The fire god's staff was indeed a powerful artifact. It was so powerful that it could even control the priests who inherited the power from it. As long as the first black fire in one's body was obtained from the fire god's staff, and used it as a foundation to practice witchcraft, they would never be able to get rid of the fire god's staff's restriction. In other words, whoever controlled this artifact would have absolute control over the many priests who were enlightened by the fire god's staff. It was definitely enough to make them unable to resist even if they died. As for Lu Chen, he was an exception, because the power of the black fire in his body did not originate from the fire god's staff. After knowing this secret, Hui Yan's confidence increased greatly. After careful consideration, he finally cast aside his worries and began to nurture the next generation of priests of the Black Fire tribe. And during this process, Lu Chen also cooperated and selected some of the witchcraft that he had comprehended to pass on to the newcomers. However, unexpected troubles still occurred. The witchcraft inheritance of this tribe was indeed mysterious and unimaginable danger. Even Lu Chen himself could not explain it clearly. There were a total of 7 barbarian priest candidates. After Hui Yan personally used the fire god's staff to enlighten them and pass on the power of the black flame, they seemed to be normal at first. However, after they continued to practice, an abnormal situation occurred after only 2 months. People started dying. The first to die was a barbarian man from the Thunder Lizard tribe. One morning, he walked out of his house in a good mood. In fact, no matter what, the Thunder Lizard tribe had already been destroyed, and he himself was just an ordinary person in the tribe. He was captured by the Black Fire tribe and thought that he would suffer a lot or even lose his life. Who knew that he would have the chance to become a priest that he didn't even dare to dream of in the past? It was impossible for him not to be happy. However, it was precisely this optimistic person who was looking forward to the future. That morning, in front of many people of the Black Fire tribe, when he was walking towards the black-robed priest's stone house to receive training, a huge black flame suddenly burst out from his body and engulfed him in a frenzy. The barbarian screamed and screamed, but it was of no use. The black flame engulfed him, and under the horrified gazes of the crowd, he died in extreme pain. This matter quickly caused a stir in the entire Black Fire tribe. Countless people whispered and discussed about it. Some people were gloating, some said that it was a punishment from the gods. But all the voices were suppressed in the end, because whether it was Hui Yan or Lu Chen, they had no way out. After this first accident, the following days were no longer peaceful. All kinds of mysterious and strange phenomena began to gradually occur. Among the 7 people, 1 from the Thunder Lizard tribe died. Then, after another half a month, another suddenly went crazy. It happened without any warning. In the morning, he seemed to be completely fine, but suddenly he went crazy. He grabbed people he saw on the road and madly bit them like a dog. After being subdued by the guards who rushed over, the man still couldn't calm down and became unreasonably violent. After being locked in a cage, he continued to roar day and night. That mournful voice reverberated in the sky above the Black Fire tribe's camp every night, like the most terrifying curse in the world. 3 days later, this madman died. Then, after another month, the 3rd person died. His death was extremely strange. His entire body and limbs fell off inexplicably, and then he died silently. It was said that the person's expression was still very peaceful, as if he had suddenly died in his sleep. With such strange things happening one after another, the entire Black Fire tribe began to panic. Even a strong leader like Hui Yan was under great pressure at this moment. When the situation was at its most tense, there were all kinds of rumors circulating in the Black Fire tribe. Many said that the fire god was enraged and sent down divine punishment, or that the fire god was angry that his power had been stolen by outsiders and so on. Even when Hui Yan repeatedly explained that he had absolute control over the fire god's staff, he could not stop the spread of such rumors. Fortunately, after that, this phenomenon temporarily quieted down. The remaining 4 people did not experience any more strange things, and gradually obtained the power of the Black Fire through cultivation. Although they were still far from Lu Chen, the growth of the priests had always been slow. They were the norm, and people like Lu Chen were the abnormal ones. After a year, everything finally calmed down. The power of the Black Fire tribe grew day by day, and the new priests began to really understand the power of witchcraft. At the same time, just as Lu Chen had planned, they could not escape the control of the fire god's staff, and could only listen to the orders of Hui Yan, who had the fire god's staff. Lu Chen did what he had to do, and Hui Yan did not lie to him. He told him the secret way to return north. That way is in the Great Snow Mountain. When that day came, Hui Yan told Lu Chen the secret that he had hidden deep in his heart. The Great Snow Mountain is snowy all year round and frozen for tens of thousands of miles. But for 3 days a year, there is a hidden canyon in the mountain where the wind and snow will stop. In between the cliffs, there is a dangerous path that leads to the land of confusion. Lu Chen looked deeply at this barbarian, frowned, and asked, "You walked through that dangerous path?" Hui Yen shook his head and said in a low voice, "That path is not for humans. It is too dangerous, I dare not walk it." Lu Chen stared at him and questioned, "Then how do you know that it leads to the land of confusion in the north?" Hui Yen said, "Because I once saw a huge demonic beast leap over that ravine. In its bloody mouth, there was a corpse's remains. I could tell that it wasn't a barbarian." Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. Hui Yen continued, "Other than the strongest demon beasts, it is impossible for humans to survive on the Great Snow Mountain. Whether it is the human race or the barbarian race, it is impossible. There have been no humans in the wasteland for many years, so that demon beast must have come from the land of confusion." He then sighed and said, "I swear to the heavens that these words are absolutely true. However, that path is indeed too dangerous, and you will most likely die if you go there. Lu Chen, I will say the same thing. As long as you are willing to stay and work hard with me in the future, I will share all the glory and wealth with you." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then said, "There is no need, I will try." He then paused and asked casually, "What did that giant beast look like?" It looked like a giant wolf." "Giant wolf?" "Yes." Hui Yen thought for a moment, then used his finger to point at the big black dog lying lazily beside Lu Chen. "It looks a bit like it, but it's much bigger than it." Chapter 357. The night before he left the Black Fire tribe, Lu Chen stayed alone in the priest's stone house. He had lived in this dark stone house for a long time. Now that he had decided to leave, he looked around and found that there was actually nothing he was reluctant to part with. Perhaps he had never had any feelings or nostalgia for anything in this wilderness. Sometimes, Lu Chen even felt that his coming to the southern wilderness might just be a joke of fate. When he stayed here, he did not leave behind anything too good, probably only the seeds of hatred and all kinds of blood and killing. In the dark stone house, other than him, there was only Atu. In the past year, this huge black wolf seemed to have grown even fatter. The reason was probably because he had been eating well. Although the northern part of the wilderness was still barren, now that the Black Fire tribe had unified the north and taken in the 4 tribes, their sphere of influence had expanded rapidly. Their territory had become larger, and the food they obtained was several times more than before. With the help of the black-robed priest, Atsu was now living like a celestial dog. All he did was eat and sleep all day long. His life was too free and unfettered. Originally, there was another figure in this stone house. That was the original maid. However, after Lu Chen selected her as a possible candidate for the priestess, Yezi left the place and lived in the residence specially prepared for the new priestesses. Hui Yen had also discussed with Lu Chen about sending 2 more maids over. He even joked that perhaps the maids sent to him would also become priests after a period of time. Lu Chen directly refused. The night was cold, and Lu Chen was still awake. This night he seemed to be more awake than in the past. Then he suddenly missed the feeling of dreaming. Some time ago, on a night in this stone house, he suddenly had a dream. He dreamed of the dead Baldi Supreme Tianlan and himself when he was still young. He thought he had forgotten that childhood memory, but he found that he still remembered it. He found that he actually missed the dead Baldi. But when he appeared in front of that person again, how would he react? In this world, the only person that Lu Chen could not see through was probably him. Atu had already fallen into a deep sleep by his side. Although this black dog had experienced all kinds of pain in the past, but now that it was by Lu Chen's side, it seemed to have completely let down its guard, and trusting everything to its master, trusting him wholeheartedly. Well, a naturally lazy dog. Lu Chen smiled bitterly and touched the fur on Atsu's head. It was unusually soft and smooth. Then, he thought of what Hui Yen had told him that day, about the horrible demon that had appeared in the secret path of the Great Snow Mountain. Lu Chen had once questioned Hui Yen about why he had come to that exceptionally dangerous snowy mountain, and how he had avoided that terrifying demonic beast. However, Hui Yan had kept his mouth shut, only making a heavy oath to Lu Chen, indicating that what he had said was not a lie. Lu Chen could see that Hui Yan was not lying, but he could also imagine that the danger of that path was unimaginably great. It was very likely that he himself would not be able to walk through it. It was also because of this that Hui Yan, perhaps feeling a little guilty in his heart, came over several times to persuade him to stay in the Great Snow Mountain. However, Lu Chen still decided to leave. A long time ago, he had always felt that he was alone, without any worries. He could travel to the ends of the earth without any restraint, and anywhere was his home. However, it was only after he came to the Great Snow Mountain of the southern wilderness and spent several years here that he came to a realization. It turned out that there was always a yearning and nostalgia in everyone's heart. His heart still yearned for the vast divine continent of the human race in the north. Even if there were many people there who did not like him, hated him, and even wanted to kill him, he was still willing to live with the people there. He did not like the barbarians around him. Even if the people in the north liked to scheme and fight for power, he still liked that place. He belonged to the human race. This had never changed and would never change. The sound of footsteps came from outside the house, and was immediately stopped by someone. It was the black fire guards who were guarding outside his stone house. Now, with the rapid increase in the strength of the Black Fire tribe, and the large number of captives from other tribes, the number of black fire guards had also increased rapidly. Now, it had exceeded the number of warriors from the Black Fire tribe by almost half. It could be said that they were the most powerful force in the Black Fire tribe. Such a powerful force was enough to overturn everything, enough to destroy everything in this tribe. It was probably because of this that the Black Fire tribe, led by Hui Yan, were worried and dissatisfied. Lu Chen could imagine that no matter how dignified Hui Yan's many excuses were, and how he paid attention to friendship, dreams, and the glory of his ancestors, but the worry of the Black Fire guards, this powerful force that he could not completely control, was perhaps the reason why he finally decided to tell Lu Chen the secret and let him leave. Lu Chen was not surprised by this. In his heart, which was not known to others, from the beginning, he had been deliberately working in this direction. The barbarians, especially those in the north of the wilderness, were mostly simple-minded. Even if there was an unusual person like Hui Yan, but in terms of scheming, they were still not as good as Lu Chen, who had been tempered in the devil cult for countless days since he was young. Of course, in the years after he left, what these people would become was not something that Lu Chen cared about. There was a low voice outside the door, but the reply that came made Lu Chen a little surprised. He had thought that it would be Hui Yan who would come at this time, because there was still a very important matter that Hui Yan had not gotten an answer from him. But now, it seemed that Hui Yan was more patient than he had expected. The person who came was a barbarian woman, who was once his maid. When he walked into the dimly lit stone house, she could not help but be in a trance for a moment. This year, for her, was also a time of great changes. When she was told that the black-robed priest had named her as a candidate for the priest, Ye's mind went blank. Even after such a long time, even though she had begun to come into contact with and master the power of witchcraft, Ye was still in awe of the black figure. But when she walked into the house, after the initial nervousness, she quickly felt a sense of familiarity, as if she had returned home. This feeling made her feel very strange, but she still carefully put away her feelings, came to the black-robed priest's seat, and silently knelt down. Lu Chen looked at her and said, "I have told you that you are now a tribal priest, so you don't have to sit in front of me like a maid." Ye's body moved, and after a moment of hesitation, she still knelt down and said, I will stay like this." Lu Chen no longer cared about her and said, "What's the matter? At this time, no one else has come, only you suddenly came to see me." Ye's face was a little blurred in the darkness. She could feel the black shadow in front of her, and the lazy dog sleeping on the other side. As a priest, she was now qualified to know some secrets, including that the person in front of her and the dog would leave tomorrow. As for where they were going, no one would say, and no one dared to ask. Probably in this tribe, only the chief Hui Yan knew. Seeing Ye's hesitation, Lu Chen frowned and said, "What is the matter?" Hearing his shout, Yezi panicked. After such a long time, she still seemed to be the timid handmaiden in front of this black-robed priest. She was still unable to resist his majesty, and the fear of him seemed to follow her like a shadow that she could not get rid of. She nervously clenched her hands, and after a long hesitation, she whispered, "The chief asked me to come." Lu Chen's eyes flickered, and he seemed to be a little surprised by the answer. Then he seemed to think of something, and smiled faintly, saying, "It seems that I still overestimated him." Yi did not hear him clearly and asked in surprise. Lu Chen did not answer her and said, "What did he ask you to come here for?" Yi hesitated for a moment and said, "Well, the chief said that you still have a very important thing here, and you have not given it to him. If you are leaving tomorrow morning, he asked me to come and get it and bring it to him." Lu Chen looked calm, sitting in the shadow, and did not have the slightest intention of returning the thing, nor did he speak. Yi waited for a while, only to feel that there was an invisible pressure gradually spreading in the surrounding darkness, making people feel a little breathless. After a long time, such a sentence suddenly came from the darkness, "What does he want? Let him come to me himself." Yi looked at him blankly, but did not dare to disobey this mysterious and terrifying black-robed priest, and nodded repeatedly. But soon she heard the voice of the black-robed priest say, "By the way, since you happen to be here, I have something and I will give it to you." Yi was taken aback and looked up in surprise and said, "Sir, what is it?" Lu Chen raised his hand, and a white thing flew out of the darkness and was thrown to Yi. Yi reached out and caught it. It was cold to the touch. She held it tight and looked down. Suddenly, her whole body trembled, and an indescribable complex expression appeared on her face. There was surprise, pain, hatred, fear, and even more sadness. In her hand was a white bone mask, which was the ancestral relic that Lu Chen had taken from her tribe on the day when the Divine Wood tribe was exterminated. "Sir, this is?" Yi asked in a trembling voice. "Well, this is something that belongs to your Divine Wood tribe. You keep it." Lu Chen's voice sounded a little erratic, but it seemed to have a deeper meaning. He said lightly, "Maybe you will need it in the future." Chapter 358. Lu Chen didn't tell Yi when and how this white bone mask, which was left behind by the ancestors of the Divine Wood tribe, would be useful in the future. Yezi wanted to ask, but Lu Chen had already chased her out before she could open her mouth. Yezi, who was full of doubts, did not dare to resist the mysterious black-robed priest. She could only retreat, and at the same time, she hid the white bone mask in her bosom and wrapped it tightly, afraid that it would be seen by others. No matter what, the Divine Wood tribe had been destroyed and disappeared from this wasteland. At this moment, in name, she and the remaining tribesmen were also part of the Black Fire tribe. If this item was seen and recognized by someone, it would probably cause an unfathomable storm. After all, in the past days, Yezi had seen with her own eyes the killing of those who still cherished their ancestors in front of the entire tribe more than once. But despite this danger, Yezi still accepted the white bone mask without any hesitation. When she left the dark stone house, she subconsciously looked to the side. The expressionless black fire guards only turned to look at her, and then looked away. Yezi breathed a sigh of relief, and hurriedly left the place. The sky was bright. Lu Chen walked out of the priest's stone house with Atsu. The people of the Black Fire tribe who had been waiting outside were already standing in a row. From the chief Huiyen to the tribal generals like White Eagle, Iron Bear, Black Bull, and Yi and a group of new priests, almost all the important figures of the tribe were present. Around them, there were even more Black Fire guards standing there with complicated expressions. But when they saw Lu Chen, they were all taken aback. Because on this morning, under the light of dawn, the human man who had been in the image of a black-robed priest for a long time suddenly took off the black robe and changed into his original clothes. An indescribable subtle atmosphere slowly spread in this corner of the tribe's camp. When the black robe disappeared, people suddenly felt that there was a huge gap between them and Lu Chen. Before, people were in awe of this black-robed priest, afraid of his power and witchcraft. In this long period of time, they had even forgotten his original identity and regarded him as an extremely important member of the Black Fire tribe. But on this morning, everyone suddenly understood that he was about to leave. He would no longer have anything to do with this tribe. Or perhaps, there was a possibility that they would be enemies? No one spoke and no one came forward to greet him. The atmosphere in front of the priest's stone house was a little awkward, and there was a subtle tension. On one side was a lonely human, and on the other side was a huge crowd of more than 100 barbarians. Some people in the crowd could not help but look around, and some people stared at Lu Chen with sparkling eyes. Lu Chen walked until he was about 100 feet in front of the crowd and stopped. He looked at the people in front of him. There was not much expression on his calm face. On the other hand, the black wolf Atsu, who had followed him for a long time and had been eating and drinking, suddenly seemed to have recovered its energy and spirit. It suddenly let out a low growl, and the fur on its neck stood up. Its eyes were fierce, and it stared at the large number of barbarians in front of it. It bared its fangs without fear, and looked as if it wanted to bite a few of them to death to see if the barbarians' flesh tasted good. Lu Chen did not seem to notice the fierce behavior of the black wolf beside him. He continued to look at the crowd in front of him with a calm face, and even a hint of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. There seemed to be a deeper sense of mockery and contempt hidden in the depths of that smile. A man and a wolf, and a large group of silent but murderous barbarians, confronted each other in a somewhat strange way. After a while, suddenly Hui Yan, who was standing at the front of the crowd, laughed out loud. He strode forward, and then opened his arms, and gave Lu Chen a warm hug. "Brother, I've come to see you off," he said while laughing. The tense atmosphere in the crowd of barbarians suddenly eased. Many people could not help but let out a sigh of relief. There were also many people who loosened their grip on the hilt of their swords. Lu Chen smiled at him and said, "Thank you." Hui Yan pulled his arm and walked out of the camp side by side. Along the way, they talked cheerfully and wittily. Behind them, a large group of people followed silently. Just like that, they walked to the main gate of the tribe's camp. Hui Yan was still holding on to Lu Chen's hand and said with a smile, "Brother, are you really not going to consider staying and assisting me? To be honest, as long as you are here, no matter how vast the wilderness is, no matter how strong the enemy is, I will not have the slightest fear." Lu Chen said, "Patriarch, you're a man of great ambition and vision. You don't need my meager strength to accomplish great things. I still have some concerns in the north, so I have no choice but to return. Please forgive me, tribe leader." Hui Yan stared at him, and his expression was slightly complicated and heavy. He said, "That road is exceptionally dangerous. Even if you have a slim chance of survival, will it be all right?" Lu Chen pondered for a moment, then nodded and said, "I still want to go and try." Hui Yan sighed, nodded and said, "I also know that you have made up your mind. I just want to persuade you to stay for one last time. But since things have come to this, then forget it. I can only wish you a safe journey." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Thank you." Hui Yan let go of his arm and looked deeply at Lu Chen. After waiting for a moment, seeing that Lu Chen still did not move, he could not help but frown, and could only open his mouth and say, do you still have something here?" Lu Chen seemed to come to a realization and nodded, I do have something to say to you, but these words are not convenient for others to hear. How about this, tribe leader? You send me off alone. How about it?" Hui Yan was startled and said with some hesitation, "Why, can't you say it here?" Lu Chen said, "We're brothers, so there are some things we should talk about in private." Hui Yan's eyebrows twitched, and a strange expression flashed across his face. After a moment of silence, he said, "We have known each other for so long, but this is the first time you have said the word, brother." Lu Chen's expression was calm, and he said, "Anyway, we are leaving soon, there is no harm in saying it." Hui Yan laughed, nodded, and said, "All right, since you have said this word, I will also send you off. Let's go." After saying this, he and Lu Chen walked forward side by side. Many of the barbarians beside them heard their words, and their expressions changed for a moment. Tai Xiong, He Niu, and the others couldn't help but speak out to persuade them. On the other side, the four priests, including Yi, had complicated expressions, and looked on without saying a word. Hui Yan turned around, and with an indifferent expression he waved his hand and said, Lu Chen and I have a deep friendship, and it is not something you can understand. All of you stay here, and you are not allowed to follow. Everyone was speechless, and they looked at each other. In the end, they had no choice but to obey and stand on the spot, and watch the two people walk into the depths of the wasteland. Those subordinates of yours seem to be very worried? When they were a distance away from the tribe, and the figures of the people behind them had become blurry, Lu Chen suddenly opened his mouth and said to Hui Yan. Hui Yan's expression didn't change, and he casually replied with a smile, That is not strange. You, the black-robed priest, have always been fierce and impressive, and everyone is afraid of you. Lu Chen smiled and couldn't help but ask, You are also afraid of me? Hui Yan shook his head and said, I am not afraid. Lu Chen was a little curious, and after looking at him, he playfully said, Why is that? Are you not afraid that I will take advantage of the fact that you are alone and kill you? Hui Yan lightly said, You have witchcraft, and you are not controlled by the fire god's staff, so of course you have the ability to kill me. But I think, no matter what, you won't kill me. Why do you say that? Lu Chen asked. Hui Yan stopped walking and looked into the distance. He saw that the wasteland was vast and desolate, and the cold wind swept across the land. It was a bleak scene. In your heart, you originally wanted me to be that killing knife, and in the future, we, the barbarians, will fight and kill each other, isn't that right? The smile on Lu Chen's face slowly faded. He quietly stared at the barbarian in front of him, and the depths of his pupils seemed to shrink slightly. After a while, he nodded and said, You are indeed much smarter than those barbarians. Hui Yan smiled, but his expression still looked a little bleak. He lightly said, What's the use of being smart? I know your intentions, but I still have to walk this path. You can choose not to leave. After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, Even though this is not what I wanted, but since you have been honest with me today, I can also say that you can also protect your current foundation and not go south. Then, the Black Fire tribe can also maintain this situation for at least a few decades. Hui Yan coldly laughed, but spat and proudly said, I killed my father, abandoned my son, and abandoned everything, not for this small situation. In the future, no matter how difficult and dangerous it is, or how much blood will flow, I will definitely restore the glory of the ancestors of the Black Fire tribe. Isn't it just dead people? The more dead, the better. He looked up to the sky and laughed. His expression was heroic, wild, and untamed. Lu Chen looked at him from the side, then slowly nodded and lightly smiled. Chapter 359. Give it to me. Hui Yan stretched out his large hand until it reached in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked left and right and saw that this place was indeed very far from the Black Fire tribe. Apart from the two of them, there was no one else around. He nodded and said, Give me the fire god's staff. Hui Yan pulled out the fire god's staff from a bag on his substitute body. Lu Chen looked at it and asked, Have you been carrying it with you these days? Hui Yan lightly said, This divine weapon is so important. How can I let it leave my hands? In the future, I will have to rely on it for my grand plans and even control of the tribe. He caressed the staff a few times and handed it over to Lu Chen. In that instant he seemed to sigh and bitterly smiled. But I also did not think that the only person in this world that I can hand over this staff without worry would be you, a human. Lu Chen gently took it and said, If you are like this, you will be very sad in the future. I'm afraid it will be very difficult to find someone that you can completely trust. Hui Yan coldly laughed and proudly said, As long as I have the god's staff, I don't need anyone else. Lu Chen looked deeply at him and nodded. Good. I hope that in a few decades, you will still be able to say this. As he spoke, he held one end of the fire god's staff and placed the other end next to Hui Yan's large head. Then, he began to chant a strange incantation in a low voice. As his voice echoed, the runes on the fire god's staff lit up one by one. A strange black flame gently burned. At the same time, Hui Yan suddenly frowned, as if he felt something. Then, he concentrated and listened, as if he was trying to memorize it. After a while, Lu Chen listened and said to Hui Yan, "Have you memorized it?" The flame closed its eyes and was silent for a while. Then, it opened its eyes and nodded. Lu Chen waved his hand and the light shadow on the fire god's staff disappeared. Everything returned to its original state. He then returned the divine weapon to Hui Yan and said, "Remember this in your heart. This technique can only borrow the power of the fire god staff to control the hundreds of black fire guards that I have created with the runes, but it cannot create new people. In other words, if you want more black fire guards in the future, you can only rely on your priests to inscribe runes and control the priests to control more black fire guards. Even if this group of people is the most reliable and powerful force you have right now, it can be considered a gift from me before I leave." "Gift?" Hui Yan muttered. "When we left the tribe's camp, I saw the expressions of the black fire guards. Many of them seemed to want to rush over and kill you." Lu Chen smiled and said, "They only dare to think about it. If one of them really rushed out, I'll take it that he has the guts." Hui Yan looked at him and frowned. "Although you have given these people to me, but hearing you humiliate the warriors of the brute tribe, I still feel unhappy." Lu Chen smiled and shook his head. "First, I will leave soon. I don't know if I will live or die. Why should I care about what you brute tribe think? Second, those people who are cowardly but have no choice but to listen to orders and fight to the death, isn't that what you want? Isn't this kind of black fire guards more useful?" After he finished speaking, he laughed and patted Hui Yan's shoulder. "Don't you think so?" Hui Yan was silent for a long time. In the end, he laughed bitterly and said, "Scram." Walking into the depths of the wasteland, there was no one in front or behind them, only the wind blowing. Then they also stopped. Lu Chen turned around and said, "Let's go." Hui Yan nodded, but suddenly opened his mouth to stop him, saying, "Wait a moment." Lu Chen stopped and said, "What? Is there something else?" Hui Yan thought for a while and said, "Will we have the chance to meet again in the future?" Lu Chen thought for a while, then shook his head and said, "It should be impossible. This time, when I return north, if the path in the Great Snow Mountain is really as dangerous as you said, if my luck is not good, I'm afraid I won't be able to walk out and will die there. But if my luck is good, I think I won't come back." He turned his head to look at the surrounding scenery of the wasteland and said, "I don't like this place." Hui Yan sighed and said, "What a pity, I really want you to stay, and sometimes I also think, after you leave, I probably won't have anyone to talk to so frankly in my life." Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He looked at him and said, "What? It sounds like you really want to have a friend to talk to?" Hui Yan was silent for a moment before he burst into laughter. He waved his hand and said, "It's just a joke. In this wasteland, we barbarians only believe in strength. No friend can compare to this." As he spoke, he grabbed the fire god's staff and waved it in front of Lu Chen. Then he said proudly, "Just you wait. In the future, when I succeed, I will definitely think of a way to go north to visit your human territory. At that time, if we are fated to meet again, we will drink to our heart's content. Perhaps at that time, for your sake, I will be a bit merciful and kill a few of your people." "North?" Lu Chen smiled, then nodded and said, "That's ambitious. Good, I will wait for you. But your merciful heart, have you heard of the Bodhisattva of the divine central plains?" "Bodhisattva? What is that?" "Just a legendary merciful immortal. But forget it, you don't need to know. After all." Lu Chen turned around and strode forward. At the same time, he said, "After all, in your heart, there is no longer a god. Live a few more years." Hui Yan said with a laugh, "You too." There would always be parting in life, just like a banquet that would eventually end. But this trip to the southern border was like a fleeting dream, making it impossible for one to love it. Lu Chen and Atu walked away with big strides. Occasionally, they would turn their heads to look back, and they would see that the tall and sturdy barbarian was still standing in the wilderness. However, his figure was gradually becoming blurry. What would everyone be like in a few decades? How different would everyone's fate be? Or perhaps, these two people who were at opposite ends of the world, who should have been separated by a great distance and never intersected, might not even be able to live to that time. Who knew? Lu Chen suddenly called out as he looked at the desolate scenery in front of him. Atsu raised its head and looked at him. Actually, it turned its head. This big black wolf had stayed in this wasteland for a year or two, and its body seemed to have grown even bigger. Just by standing, it seemed to be taller than Lu Chen. "Why don't you stay here?" Lu Chen said. Atsu's footsteps suddenly stopped. It looked stunned for a moment, and then it let out a low growl. It seemed to be very angry at Lu Chen's words, and it even bared its fangs. Lu Chen smiled and glanced at the scenery around him. He then said indifferently, "The method I used to save you in the past was actually a method that the devil cult had obtained from the barbarian tribes in the chaotic lands. If I remember correctly, based on your bloodline, you should belong to the holy beast that the barbarian tribe revered." He pointed to the south. The wasteland there was wider and more distant. The vast wind blew past, and the world was a vast expanse. Over there, in the south of the wasteland, is the place where the barbarian tribe lives. There are countless powerful and prosperous tribes living there, and it is far better than this barren north. There should be your kind there, and they are also the holy beasts that were born in this land. Do you want to go find them? After saying that, he stared at Atsu to see its reaction. He saw Atsu look to the south, and then it turned its head. It seemed to grumble at Lu Chen, and then it turned around and walked in the opposite direction. Lu Chen laughed and chased after it, patted its head, and said with a smile, "Okay, then let's go together." With that, he exerted a little force in his hand, and his body rose into the air. He flipped over and sat on Atsu's back, and then said with a laugh, "Come on, let's go home." The giant black wolf looked up to the sky and howled. Its voice shook the wilderness, and then it rushed out like a black lightning, galloping across the vast and boundless wasteland. It ran faster and faster, and the more it ran, the more anxious it became, as if the earth was responding to it, as if its ancient bloodline had suddenly awakened on this day, and its blood was boiling. It galloped against the wind, rushing to the more distant mountains in the north, and behind the snow-covered peaks, to the hometown in its memory. Chapter 360. The Great Snowy Mountain was the tallest and largest mountain range in the vast land of chaos, spanning millions of miles. It was also one of the most difficult and dangerous places to cross since ancient times. This huge mountain range was windy and snowy all year round, and the weather was harsh. At the same time, there were many ferocious and powerful demonic beasts. For many years, no one had been able to pass through this barrier between the southern wilderness and the northern wilderness. However, in the hearts of the people from both the north and the south, this great snow mountain had a completely different meaning. The human race in the north regarded it as the most dangerous place in the world. They regarded it as the most dangerous place in the world. But, apart from that, they didn't have any other associations. But, among the barbarian tribes in the southern wilderness, they generally regarded this towering mountain range as a holy and lofty divine mountain. Many barbarians even believed that the god they believed in might live on the top of the Great Snow Mountain. Lu Chen only learned of this difference after he came to the southern wilderness. After all, the northern and southern tribes had been separated by the land of chaos for thousands of years. Even if there were some surviving barbarian tribes in the land of chaos, it was basically impossible for them to have any contact with the human race. When they met, they would fight to the death. How could they have the leisure to exchange cultural views? And the road that Hui Yen told Lu Chen about to return to the north happened to be in this Great Snowy Mountain. The Great Snowy Mountain was windy and snowy all year round, and the weather was extremely harsh. Especially in the depths of the mountain range, the temperature plummeted. Not to mention that ordinary people could not survive here. Even cultivators with cultivation would find it very difficult to survive here. Not to mention that the Great Snowy Mountain was filled with tyrannical demonic beasts whose strength far exceeded that of the outside world. According to the legends of the human race, any demonic beast that had grown up in the Great Snowy Mountain was almost as strong as a human Yuanying stage enlightened master. Moreover, it was said that in the deepest parts of the Great Snowy Mountain, there were a few ancient species that had been left behind from ancient times. They had long been extinct in the outside world, and only survived in the Great Snowy Mountain. Such a king of demonic beasts was extremely powerful. It was said that they were not weaker than a human deity stage enlightened master, or even stronger. It was precisely because such terrifying demon beasts resided here that no one dared to explore the depths of the demon beasts since ancient times until now. There were always a few brave people who were brave enough to venture into the demon beasts, but none of them returned. It was reasonable to say that it was impossible to pass through such a dangerous place. However, the secret that Hui Yan revealed to Lu Chen that day gave him a glimmer of hope. First of all, there were 3 days in a year where the wind and snow would stop. Second, that valley was obviously connected to the north and south. Otherwise, there was no way to explain what Hui Yan had said about seeing a demonic beast holding a human corpse in its mouth. Lu Chen had thought about this trip for a long time, but in the end he still decided to take a gamble. Even though there were people and there were people, Lu Chen of people, the snowy of snowy mountain, they were mountain. As for the way back, Lu Chen didn't really have much of a choice, even though the snowy mountains were extremely dangerous. When he fell into the Longchuan, he encountered an extremely terrifying beast and was forced to hide in the mysterious seed. Then, he was washed away by the Longchuan River to the southern wilderness. However, if he wanted to go back, this path was obviously not possible. Because the river flowed all the way into the Chaos Abyss, an even more terrifying place. Lu Chen did not think that he had the ability to survive in that terrifying place. Going upstream was also not reliable. He had gone to check and found that the upper reaches of the Longchuan River were extremely wide. He could not even see the edge of the other side. It was not like a river, but more like a vast ocean. If he wanted to go there, he had to cross the Longchuan River. However, he had already experienced the dangers of the river once. No matter what, whether it was him or Atsu, he did not want to fall into the river a second time. At least when he was walking on land, he could still have some reaction and think of a way. He was not completely helpless in the water. In the end, he could only hide in the seed and face the situation where he knew nothing about the outside world and came out with the idea of leaving his life to fate. And to be honest, don't you think it's strange? Lu Chen used his hands to block the wind and snow in front of him. He lowered his body even more, almost sticking to the back of He Langat's. At the same time, he muttered. At this moment, his whole body was lying on the back of Atsu. Compared to a human like him, He Lang Atsu was much more adapted to the environment of the Great Snowy Mountain. Climbing mountains and wading rivers, braving the wind and snow, no matter how rugged the mountain road was, Atsu walked almost like it was walking on flat ground. It was unusually easy. This made Lu Chen, who was originally very worried, overjoyed. He could not help but sigh that raising such a lazy dog for so many years was really not a waste. As the saying goes, raising a dog for many years is to use it for a moment. However, as they gradually went deeper into the Great Snowy Mountain, the wind and snow became stronger, and the mountain road became more rugged and dangerous. Even though Atsu was a monster that had already advanced, it gradually began to become a little difficult to walk. But in general, they were still much more relaxed than ordinary people. At least according to the instructions given by Hui Yan before they separated, this place was not too far from the secret canyon that he mentioned. Struggling to move forward in the howling and whistling wind and snow, Atsu's black fur seemed to have almost been dyed white. Even the huge dog's head had a lot of snow on it. Its 2 ears moved a little, and it turned back to look at Lu Chen. There was some unfriendly emotion in its eyes, probably contempt. Lu Chen did not care about it, and only said to himself, "Look, the Great Snowy Mountain is windy and snowy, and it is bitterly cold all year round. It is obviously the most difficult place to live, but why are there so many powerful monsters gathered here?" Atsu's footsteps paused slightly, and then it once again barked unhappily as if to say, "This dog is in a hurry, I don't have time to think so much." Lu Chen, on the other hand, raised his head and looked through the wind and snow at the majestic mountain in the distance. He could not even see the peak of the mountain, and said to himself, "There must be something strange about this place." Ever since they entered the Great Snowy Mountain, they had, of course, encountered many monsters along the way, but they, a man and a dog, managed to deal with them one by one. Atsu itself was a powerful monster, and when monsters that were weaker than it approached, most of them would be scared away. There were a few monsters that were not weaker than it, and some were even stronger than it, but either Lu Chen would help them, or they would use all kinds of strange methods to defeat those monsters. Or if even he could not deal with them, they would simply run away. In short, their experience along the way was that monsters that were weaker than them naturally could not defeat them, and monsters that were stronger than them could not outrun Atsu. Therefore, they stumbled along the way, but unexpectedly, they entered the depths of the great snowy mountain safely. However, although everything seemed to be going very smoothly, Lu Chen was still a little worried in his heart. That was, they should not have encountered the most powerful and terrifying monsters in the legends. No one knew where the prehistoric monsters, which were said to be as powerful as deity transformation stage perfected monarchs, were hiding in the great snowy mountain. Of course, if they could avoid meeting such terrifying monsters, of course, it would be better not to. At least for now, it seemed that Lu Chen and Atsu were quite lucky. In the evening of this day, they finally found the canyon hidden in the depths of the great snowy mountain. No one knew how long it had been since anyone came here. The open space on the periphery of the canyon was already piled up with almost waist-high snow, which made it particularly difficult for Atsu and Lu Chen to walk. However, compared to what they saw when they stuck their heads out to look into the canyon, it was as beautiful as heaven. It was a bottomless valley. Perhaps there was a strange change in the earth veins many years ago, which created such a strange place in the depths of the great snowy mountain. Below the canyon was a huge bottomless crack. It was pitch black and no one knew where it led to. Only the whistling and swirling wind and snow covered most of the huge crack in the ground. On both sides of the canyon were precipices that were tens of thousands of feet high, and it was difficult for apes and monkeys to climb. Only on one side of the precipice, as if it was the work of the gods, there was a natural precipice that was less than 2 feet wide, and some of the narrowest parts were less than 1 foot wide. The wind and snow were whistling, and behind the wind and snow, there seemed to be endless darkness. Lu Chen and Atsu stood there for a long time without saying anything. After a while, Lu Chen let out a long sigh and said, "Let's take a rest and wait for the wind and snow to stop." Chapter 361. The snowstorm in the Great Snowy Mountain was extremely strong, and it was difficult for ordinary people to stand. But in the canyon, perhaps because of the terrain, the strong wind blew down, carrying with it countless snowstorms, violently bombarding the hard stone walls on both sides. The power of the snowstorm was at least several times stronger than outside the canyon. Under such circumstances, walking on the less than 2 feet wide path was not much different from courting death. Lu Chen quickly confirmed this fact, and judged that with his and Atsu's abilities, it was indeed impossible to resist the thousands of years of natural defense in this huge mountain. He then made a very logical judgment, and decided to wait for the only 3 sunny days of the year. As for which 3 days the snowstorm would stop, Huoyan actually did not say clearly that day, but according to him, it should be around this season, at most no more than half a month. But even so, there was still a very difficult matter at hand, and that was, even if they were outside the canyon, the environment in the Great Snowy Mountain was still unbearable. The weather was freezing, the wind and snow filled the sky. Even if Lu Chen had cultivation, it was impossible to wait here day and night. However, he had a simple and convenient way to deal with this extremely difficult and dangerous problem that most people might not be able to solve. Hide in the mysterious tree hole. He braved the wind and snow, bringing Atsu around the secret canyon, and finally found a leeward cliff. The wind and snow here were much weaker, exposing a piece of hard rock. Lu Chen carefully examined the surroundings, and after confirming that there were no traces of people or monsters nearby, he brought Atsu to hide here, and then directly escaped into the mysterious tree hole. Compared to the time when he fled from the Kunlun mountain to the disorienting land in a hurry, this time on his return to the north, Lu Chen had plenty of time to prepare. Therefore, in order to avoid a predicament like last time at the bottom of the Longchuan River, or in order to at least last longer in that situation, Lu Chen stuffed more food and water into the tree hole this time. In addition, he even made a crude hourglass in his spare time in the Black Fire tribe, in order to prevent being unaware of the passage of time in the outside world when he was trapped in the tree hole. Compared to the bitter cold weather of the great snowy mountain outside, hiding in the tree hole was of course much more comfortable, but at the same time, it was very boring. The place was only so big, there was nowhere to walk, and there was nothing to see. After a long time, it was indeed a little stuffy, but fortunately, both Lu Chen and Atsu had experienced such days before, so it was tolerable. About every 3 to 4 hours, Lu Chen would come out of the tree hole to check on the situation. Firstly, to see if the snowstorm had stopped, and secondly, to check if there were any unusual movements around the seeds. However, this canyon seemed to be a very remote place. Not to mention that there were no signs of humans, even the beasts didn't like to come here. They just stayed here like this, and nothing unexpected happened. They had been safe and sound all this time. The snowstorm stopped on the 7th day after Lu Chen arrived at the valley. On that day, when Lu Chen and Atsu came out of the tree hole, they saw that the original white in front of them had suddenly disappeared. The mountains were quiet, and the sky was clear, blue, and as clean as a sparkling blue crystal. Only, at the edge of the mountain peaks further away, they could still see the white snowstorm swirling. From the looks of it, it seemed that the sudden clearing up and the stopping of the snowstorm only existed in the inner part of the Great Snow Mountain. In the outer area, the wind and snow were still blowing. Even though Lu Chen was experienced and knowledgeable, it was the first time he had seen such a strange scene. He could not help but look at it a few more times, thinking that there were indeed many strange things in the Great Snow Mountain. In fact, along the way, he had also noticed many things. For example, the most dangerous and ferocious demonic beasts in this mountain. Although most of them were extremely dangerous and violent, and the mere sight of them was terrifying, Lu Chen and Atsu had discovered that the demonic beasts in this mountain seemed to have an invisible boundary. No matter how ferocious or how angry they were, once Lu Chen and Atsu left their boundary, these demonic beasts would immediately stop, and no matter what, they would not take even half a step past their boundary. Along the way, based on this discovery, Lu Chen and Atsu fled in panic and avoided many fatal disasters. But what was the reason for this? Lu Chen still could not figure out. Just like what he could not understand, the environment of the Great Snowy Mountain was so harsh. Why were there so many powerful demon beasts that were reluctant to leave? Was it not better to go down the mountain to live in the southern wilderness? These things were probably hard to understand. Lu Chen thought about the strange things he had seen in the past few days. Then, he packed up his things and walked with Atsu to the entrance of the canyon. He looked inside. After the wind and snow stopped, the flying snow in the valley also disappeared, including the strong wind that was howling nonstop. The entire nameless valley looked dead silent, and with the dark bottomless crack below, it gave off a very gloomy feeling. Lu Chen frowned and looked around the canyon for a while. He then patted Atsu's head and said, "What do you think? We're going in now. If you're going to regret it, this is your last chance." Atsu glanced at him, but did not respond. Lu Chen laughed heartily and strode forward, walking into the canyon. The valley was very narrow, and for safety's sake, they had to stick their whole body to the cliff, and in front of them was a bottomless abyss. This kind of feeling really made people nervous and afraid. If an ordinary person was in such a situation, they would not be able to bear the pressure after walking for a long time. Their hands and feet would tremble, and in the end, they would lose control of their body and fall into the abyss. However, of course, Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. Even compared to ordinary cultivators, his mind was much calmer and more tenacious, probably because he had seen too many life and death situations. He just stuck his back to the cliff, and then began to move forward step by step. During this process, his face was calm and indifferent, as if there was no expression, including when his eyes swept across the dark abyss in front of him. There seemed to be no fluctuations, as if it was no different from walking on the flat ground. Just like that, he walked slowly, and soon he had walked more than 10 feet. However, when he occasionally turned his head back, he was startled. He saw that Atsu was still standing in the same place, and did not walk with him on this narrow path. Lu Chen stopped and shouted behind him, "What's wrong? Are you afraid?" Atsu glanced at the bottomless abyss at the bottom of the valley, and still did not seem to have any reaction. Lu Chen thought for a moment, and walked back with his back to the cliff, jumped back to Atsu's side and said, "There are two ways, one is, I will take you, and the other is, you can hide in the tree hole, and I will take you there." Atsu's head tilted, and seemed to look at Lu Chen with some doubt and confusion. Lu Chen smiled, reached out to touch Atsu's head, and said, "It's okay, this kind of terrain is really too dangerous and too difficult to walk, let alone you, even I have to." Before he finished speaking, Atsu suddenly raised a front foot, pushed Lu Chen's hand away, and then barked at him, looking a little disdainful. Lu Chen retracted his hand in shock. Just as he was about to speak, he saw the big black dog suddenly leap up, and then jump onto the precipice path. It didn't even look at the narrowness of the path, and actually ran forward as if it was flying easily and effortlessly. It didn't fear the dangers around it at all, and it walked extremely steadily as if it was running on flat ground. It didn't seem to be any slower than running on the mountains outside, and in the blink of an eye, it had run far away. After a while, Atsu stopped in the distance, turned around, and barked proudly at Lu Chen, who was still standing on the edge of the cliff, a little stunned. "Damn it!" Lu Chen, who had always been calm, suddenly cursed and said angrily, "Stupid dog, so you think I walk too slowly?" Chapter 362. Sometimes, Lu Chen felt that the black dog he had raised was not a dog, but another kind of animal. He had never seen a dog that could jump up and down such a dangerous cliff as if it was walking on flat ground. Even if the path was extremely narrow, even if the precipice was very dangerous, and there were hard stone protrusions from time to time, Atsu did not seem to care about all these hardships. On the contrary, it seemed to be enjoying itself as it walked freely. There were many places that seemed dangerous, where one wrong step could cause one to fall into a bottomless abyss, but the black dog did not even look at them as it leaped over them. Sometimes, it would even grab onto a hard rock and swing over, causing people to be extremely frightened. The dangerous moments made them want to break out in cold sweat for it. However, this big black dog did not seem to care at all. Instead, it would turn its head from time to time to look at Lu Chen, who was steadily moving forward step by step, sticking close to the precipice. It would bark a few times, and then it simply stopped and waited. There was a hint of disdain in its pair of big dog eyes. Lu Chen walked over slowly, glared at the dog, and said, "What are you looking at? Have you never seen a human walking before?" Atsu grinned, stood up, wagged its tail, and continued to walk forward. However, its movements were much lighter than Lu Chen's, and it ran a long distance in 2 or 3 steps. Looking at the huge black dog walking on the narrow precipice path, it seemed particularly uncoordinated. It seemed that it would fall at any time, but the dog was so steady that it was appalling. In the end, Lu Chen could only shake his head and sigh. He muttered, "Is this a dog or a monkey?" Of course, Atsu was still a dog, although the dog had changed a lot. Lu Chen recalled the time when he was still in Kunlun Mountain a few years ago. It seemed that during that period of time, Atsu was let loose by him at will. It ran around the vast forest and wilderness of Kunlun Mountain all day long. Could it be that the ability to climb mountains and cross rivers was trained at that time? However, there were many wild dogs in this world, and there were many that lived in the wild all day long. But apart from the one in front of him, it seemed that it was difficult to find another big dog that could have this kind of ability. Therefore, it seemed that the only explanation was that Atsu had advanced to become a holy beast. However, although he complained, Lu Chen obviously would not be angry because of this. In fact, the sudden display of Atsu's ability made Lu Chen a lot less worried. At least he did not have to consider leaving Atsu alone in the tree hole. Perhaps it was because the tree hole was too lonely, and too depressing. It was fine if Lu Chen was there, but if Lu Chen left for the outside world for a while, when he came back, Atsu would become extremely manic. He did not know if it was because of fear of Atsu. So, Lu Chen tried to avoid leaving Atsu alone in the tree hole. This canyon was not a straight line that led to the end. Instead, it was more like a twisting long snake swimming in this mysterious great snow mountain, meandering forward. As Lu Chen and Atsu gradually went deeper, they gradually saw a scene that had not been seen by the outside world for many years. The canyon was sometimes narrow and sometimes wide, and the cliffs on both sides were constantly changing according to the mountain. At the narrowest part, the cliffs on both sides seemed to almost stick together, so much so that Lu Chen could even touch the stone wall on the opposite side if he stretched out his hand. But after walking for a while, the cliffs on both sides suddenly opened up, and the cliffs on both sides were suddenly separated by hundreds of feet. It was so far that it seemed that he could not even see the opposite side clearly. There was no snow in the sky, but there were no birds flying over the canyon either. After the never-ending snowstorm temporarily stopped, there was no other sound here. Everything was a little scary, and only the sunlight falling from the sky in the distance shone into half of the canyon, adding a trace of vitality and warmth to the place. Many of the demonic beasts in the Great Snow Mountain seemed to be very disgusted with this canyon, so even after walking for a long time, Lu Chen did not see any demonic beasts here. This made him a little puzzled, because according to what Hui Yan said that day, a giant wolf demonic beast had appeared here. He quietly walked alone in this actually incomparably dangerous canyon. Other than Atsu, there were no other living creatures. After walking for a long time in this kind of place, it was easy to have a feeling of being forgotten by the whole world. But just like this, Lu Chen walked in silence for a day. When the sky was getting dark, Lu Chen finally found a slightly more spacious place on this dangerous cliff path. In fact, it was only a small platform 3 to 4 feet wide, and the stone surface was slightly protruding, but it could be considered as a rare place to rest on this road. Lu Chen looked ahead, only to see that as far as his eyes could see, the cliff path was still winding forward, and he could not see the end at all. After a few twists and turns, it turned into a place where he could not see clearly. Similarly, the mysterious canyon that he was in at the moment, even though he had walked in it for a whole day, was still winding forward, as if there was no end. Lu Chen whistled to the front. Atsu heard it, turned back to look, and then walked back along the stone wall. Lu Chen patted its head and said, "It's getting dark, let's rest here for the night." The cliff path in the canyon was a natural barrier. Walking in the day was an extremely dangerous thing, not to mention at night it was pitch black. It was really possible to fall into the abyss with one wrong step at any time. Even a bold person like Lu Chen did not dare to take this risk. Atsu lay down next to him. This small stone platform was not very big, and with the two of them here, it suddenly felt a little crowded. Lu Chen simply sat with his back against the stone wall and let Atsu lie on his thighs. This way, not only did it save space, but being covered by Atsu was also like having a warm and thick quilt on his body. It was very warm. After the sky turned dark, Lu Chen hugged Atsu, and for a moment, he also felt a little warm in his heart. He smiled slightly and then closed his eyes. Compared to the quiet Lu Chen, Atsu was a little bit restless. Its huge head kept twisting left and right, but fortunately, it probably knew that this place was not a place where it could do whatever it wanted, so most of the time it was quite obedient. Just like this, one person and one dog stayed quietly in this canyon until the last bit of light in the sky disappeared above the canyon. Darkness suddenly came, like a tide, instantly drowning everything. There was still no wind or snow at night, but it began to gradually become colder. There wasn't a single ray of light left, right, front, and back. There was a feeling of loneliness and desolation. The darkness even gave people the illusion that the abyss was right beside them, within reach, and they would fall into it with just a slight flip. There was nothing above and below them, and they were alone on the precipice. It was as if they were the only people left in the whole world at this moment. Atsu's body suddenly moved in the darkness, then it turned its head and looked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's hands were still on Atsu, and in the darkness, he saw Atsu's eyes. That pair of eyes with a bit of faint green, there seemed to be a flickering flame in the pupils, but also like a strange mirror, reflecting a vague shadow. Lu Chen stared at this pair of strange eyes, staring at the reflection in the depths of the eyes, watching it twisting with the flame, and remained silent. After a while, suddenly, the green light in Atsu's eyes suddenly brightened, as if it suddenly wanted to jump. Lu Chen was taken aback, and he quickly used his hands to pull Atsu's body. On this stone platform, which was not very big, there was no room for too much movement. After being pulled by him, Atsu seemed to think of the current situation, and its body quieted down. However, its emotions did not calm down along with its forcefully suppressed body. On the contrary, it seemed to become more and more agitated. It began to let out a deep roar, and its sharp teeth began to grind, making a clattering sound as if two sharp blades were clashing against each other. Lu Chen hugged its body tightly, and the pupil in his eyes slightly contracted. He gently pressed Atsu's head against his chest. Atsu seemed to understand what he meant and finally calmed down a little, but Lu Chen could still feel that this black wolf's body seemed to be trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" He lowered his voice and asked softly. Atsu turned his head and called out in a low voice to the people below. Lu Chen took a deep look at it, took a deep breath, and said in a low voice, "Is there something down there?" Atsu did not have any reaction, nor did it make any sound, but from the feeling that came from his arm, it seemed that this big dog's heartbeat and blood flow were all very fast. Lu Chen let out a soft breath, nodded to Atsu, and then tilted his body, slowly began to tilt his body. Bit by bit, without any sound, he stretched his head to the side, and looked at the bottom of the stone platform, at the dark and bottomless black crack. Under the stone platform, it was as dark as the sea. But at this moment, there were already waves. The darkness was like a tide, wave after wave, surging and slapping, as if there was something strange twisting, circling, and struggling under the darkness. It roared silently in the darkness, and bit by bit, it surged upwards. Chapter 363. The night was too dark and dense. It was impossible to clearly see what was in the darkness below. However, the aura coming from the space below him was abnormally majestic and powerful, causing Lu Chen to involuntarily have the illusion that he was as small as an ant. At that moment, countless thoughts flashed through Lu Chen's mind, and he also thought of the most important reason that made the Great Snow Mountain a forbidden place in the human world. In addition to the harsh and cold wind and snow in the mountain, there were also those unimaginably powerful and mysterious monsters. According to the legends, the most powerful demon beasts were primordial mutants that hid in the hidden corners of the Great Snow Mountain. They were extremely powerful, and they were not inferior to the perfected monarchs of the soul formation realm, and might even be stronger. Lu Chen didn't know if there was such a terrifying monster in the canyon under him at the moment, but in terms of feeling he felt that it was very likely, because he had never seen such a terrifying aura and huge momentum in his life. At this moment, it seemed that the whole canyon was trembling, and Lu Chen clearly felt that the stone wall behind him was also trembling nonstop. For a moment, he almost subconsciously wanted to run back to the mysterious tree hole in the seed with Atsu in his arms, but when this thought flashed through his mind, he quickly suppressed it. This place was too dangerous. The small stone platform they were on looked so fragile and narrow. Lu Chen had no confidence in what would happen to the lone seed after they hid in the tree hole to take refuge. Perhaps the terrifying monster that was about to come out would not care about this tiny thing, but in the chaos, there was a great possibility that this seed would fall into the bottomless abyss underground. At that time, perhaps it would be the truly terrifying place. Lu Chen also didn't want to find out what kind of strange things were in the depths of the dark underground. Therefore, at that critical moment, he suppressed all his fear and impulsiveness in the end, and with unimaginable determination, he hugged Atsu tightly against the cold stone wall, widened his eyes, and looked at the dark world in front of him. The darkness was rolling like a tide, and a terrible roar came from afar, making people tremble. The mountains began to tremble, and then, a rumbling sound like thunder came from the depths of the earth, as if something was climbing up step by step from the depths of the earth. Every step seemed to cross a large stone wall, making the darkness thicker and the black tide more turbulent. Atsu's body began to tremble, as if it was instinctively afraid. Lu Chen could even feel that its muscles were twisting and trembling, and its blood flow was speeding up. It even had a feeling that it was going to jump up and run for its life in the next moment. However, in such a dark night, which mysterious and terrifying monster was nearby, Running away at this moment was almost equivalent to seeking death. So, Lu Chen suddenly grabbed Atu's head and hugged it tightly in his arms. Then he lowered his body and covered Atu's head with his chest. In the darkness, he looked like a father, using his body to block all the dangers for his child, blocking all the darkness outside. Atsu's body, which was about to go berserk, suddenly trembled. Perhaps it felt the warmth of Lu Chen's chest, or perhaps it heard the heartbeat of this man's chest, or perhaps it was comforted by the embrace. Atsu quieted down and no longer made any movements. It just silently nestled in Lu Chen's arms. The night was dark and cold, the black tide was dancing wildly, and the black shadows were going crazy. In the corner of the shadow, two tiny ant-like shadows were still holding on, silently enduring. When the darkness boiled to its limit and the mountain shook violently, an indescribable aura suddenly burst out of the ground. Lu Chen looked at it closely, but he couldn't see it clearly no matter how hard he tried. Everything was covered in darkness, but the darkness itself seemed to have merged into one, slowly rising from the crack in the ground not far away from him. It felt like if Lu Chen stretched out his hand, he might be able to touch the monster in the darkness. They were so close, as if there was only a thin line between life and death. Lu Chen held Atsu, gritted his teeth, and remained motionless. The terrifying monster in the darkness didn't seem to notice that there were two tiny creatures on the cliff of the canyon, or to it, those two things were not much different from real ants. The huge shadow was almost impossible to see in the night, and Lu Chen couldn't tell how big the monster was. Perhaps the darkness itself increased people's fear, making people imagine the monster to be even more terrifying. However, he could sense that the monster had left the crevice and was climbing upwards. Then, it left the canyon. When the boundless darkness surged to the top of the mysterious canyon, a terrifying howl came from the top of the mountain. The howl shook the surrounding wilderness and the mountains. Rocks of all sizes began to fall from the precipice. Lu Chen endured the pain of being smashed by the rocks as he tried his best to maintain his balance. Suddenly, he muttered a curse, but no one could hear what he was cursing. The unknown underground monster appeared in the night. Of course, it couldn't just stand on the top of the mountain and howl a few times. Soon, Lu Chen felt that the breath started to go away. At the same time, there was a burst of indescribable strange sounds in the mountains further away. It sounded like a fight, a howl, a shout, and a cry of despair. Is it looking for food? This was the first thought that came to Lu Chen's mind. But in this world of ice and snow, the only food that could be found were those equally powerful and fierce monsters. Lu Chen sucked in a breath of cold air and sat still in his original spot. The dark night seemed to be particularly desolate and long. He didn't know how long he had waited, but at a certain moment in the night, suddenly, the terrifying and powerful breath returned again. In an instant, the same scene of the earth shaking and the mountains boiling happened again. Atsu was a little excited again, but under Lu Chen's comfort, he held back. Then, Lu Chen watched the huge shadow slowly return to the bottomless abyss under the cliff in the darkness until everything calmed down. The night was cold, and he couldn't see his fingers in front of him. It was as if nothing had happened in the darkness. However, there was a different breath here and Lu Chen could feel it. It was the faint smell of blood that came with the wind. No one knew when Atsu fell asleep, lying on Lu Chen's lap and sleeping soundly. But Lu Chen didn't sleep. His eyes were always open, looking at the darkness in front of him, until dawn. When the sun rose, the first ray of light dispelled the darkness here, and Lu Chen saw the canyon again. It was quiet in the canyon, and it seemed to be exactly the same as yesterday. It was so quiet as if there were no living creatures here at all. Lu Chen sighed softly, then patted Atsu's head, and woke the big black dog up from its dream. Atu woke up with sleepy eyes. He first looked left and right, then looked up at the sky. After staring blankly for a while, he suddenly let out a happy cry. He then jumped up and ran forward while wagging his tail. After running for a while, he even turned back and barked at Lu Chen, as if urging him to hurry up. Lu Chen also stood up with a smile, and let out a long sigh of relief. Then, after stretching his body, he continued to walk forward. They walked forward for about 100 feet. Suddenly, Atsu stopped. It didn't bark, nor did it walk. It just looked up at the high mountain cliff in front of it. Lu Chen walked behind it and was slightly surprised. He also looked up, and then his body also trembled. On the towering precipice of the canyon, under the illumination of the rare sunlight, there were a few huge claw marks on the stone walls, like sharp blades directly cutting open the incomparably hard stone walls. And at a higher place, at the peak of the mountain, there was a large mass of shocking blood stains. Some places had dried up, but there was still more blood dripping down from the stone walls of the mountain, like a blood waterfall, so frighteningly displayed in front of their eyes. The smell of blood in the air suddenly became extremely strong. Chapter 364. Lu Chen and Atsu both stared at the blood stains on the mountain for a long time. Then, Lu Chen retracted his gaze, patted Atsu's head gently, and said in a low voice, "Let's go." Atsu looked back at him, then continued to walk forward without saying a word. Although the canyon was already quiet, although both of them were still walking steadily, the atmosphere seemed to be faintly gloomier and more depressing than before. In contrast, Lu Chen seemed to be calmer, and his face was calm, while Atsu was not as cheerful as it was yesterday. They continued along the path of the precipice, and the ravine stretched on before them in all its twists and turns, and still seemed to have no end. The length of the canyon was somewhat beyond Lu Chen's expectation. After walking for a long time and still not seeing the exit, Lu Chen's face began to become a little gloomy. In the mysterious tree hole in the seed, he had stored enough food and water, which was enough to support him and Atsu for a long time, so he was not worried about food. But the most worrisome thing at the moment was another matter. It had been a day and a half since he first entered the canyon. In a year, there were only 3 sunny days in the Great Snow Mountain, which meant that in another half a day, the unusually violent snowstorm would flood this place again. Lu Chen still clearly remembered the scene of the snowstorm when he first came out of the canyon that day. It was too difficult and dangerous to walk through this cliff path in that kind of situation. However, what was more troublesome was that he had now walked so far, and it was almost impossible to go back. This was probably the so-called dilemma. Maybe Atsu did not think so much, but since just now, it had been looking back at Lu Chen from time to time, with a doubtful and worried look in its eyes. It probably wanted to see if Lu Chen had the intention to go back. Lu Chen understood what Atsu meant, but after a moment of thinking, he quickly made a decision. "Let's go, Atsu." He pointed to the front of the canyon. Atsu stared at him for a moment, and then, as if a huge stone had been lifted from his heart, he no longer hesitated and paced back and forth. Even the initial pressure seemed to have disappeared. He returned to his original relaxed self and began to run forward. After running for a while, it turned back and barked twice, as if it was complaining that Lu Chen was too slow. Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. As they continued to walk forward, all kinds of strange scenery in this mysterious canyon gradually appeared in front of them. There were all kinds of strange peaks and rocks, steep cliffs, and precipices like swords and mirrors, decorated with white snow, which was also a rare wonder in the world. But as they went deeper into the canyon, Lu Chen soon saw that on the mountain walls on both sides of the canyon, there were more scratch marks that he had seen before. It looked like some kind of unknown giant beast had climbed here, and at every distance, he could vaguely see a little bit of dried blood stain. He glanced at the dark abyss that he couldn't see clearly, frowned, and then continued walking forward. The days slowly passed as they walked and stopped. They still couldn't see the exit of the canyon, but the huge claw marks constantly reminded them of the danger that was lurking everywhere. The sky gradually darkened again. Before the evening came, Lu Chen and Atsu finally found a place to rest. It was similar to the stone platform they stayed on last night. It was also a slightly wider platform, but it was better than yesterday. The stone wall here was probably peeled off over the years, forming a concave gap. It was about the width of a person, and could barely be regarded as a small cave. After seeing this place and seeing that it was getting late, even though it was not dusk yet, Lu Chen quickly decided to stop here to rest. Walking in this unknown place was inexplicably heavy pressure. Knowing nothing about the front, he could only take one step at a time. Although Lu Chen appeared to be very calm and collected most of the time, from yesterday until now, It was equivalent to him walking on this extremely dangerous precipice path for 2 whole days. His back was pressed against the stone wall, and beneath his feet was a bottomless abyss. His life was in danger at all times, and even when he was resting last night, there were still those mysterious and terrifying monsters appearing and disappearing. He also did not sleep for the whole night, and kept his eyes open until dawn. After being tense for such a long time, even if he had a strong will and cultivation, he still felt a deep sense of exhaustion. So, after choosing a place to rest, he called out to Atu and curled up in the small cave. It was said to be half a small cave because the stone wall was only slightly concave. At most, his body could only lean on it, but most of his hands and feet were still outside. But even so, this kind of terrain still made Lu Chen feel a little relieved. Atsu ran over and looked at him curiously, then looked left and right, and finally looked at the stone wall on the opposite side. There was a huge claw mark, which was cut down from the mountain cliff. It was exposed in front of them, and it was about 100 feet away. Atsu looked for a while, and then shrunk its body. Just like yesterday, it once again lay down beside Lu Chen. Lu Chen smiled, hugged Atsu, and then one man and one dog silently watched the sky slowly darken. The sky darkened, night once again arrived. Sometimes, people would suddenly feel a kind of insignificance, indescribably aware of the fragility of life. Also, the world was so vast, the creation of heaven and earth was so mysterious. This kind of feeling would always follow people throughout their lives, always appearing in a lonely moment in the dead of night, or when you looked up at the boundless sky alone. Lu Chen was in the darkness, quietly looking at the dark sky. At that moment, he suddenly remembered many things from a long time ago. When he was young, he had once firmly believed in this belief, and he did not hesitate to risk his life for it. That belief was the only thing that allowed him to survive through the most difficult and dangerous days. Until today, he had never wavered much in that belief. But there were many, many things that were once engraved in his heart. He had once felt so much pain that he thought he would never forget them. But on this night, when he suddenly thought of them, he realized that he hadn't thought of them for a long time. Time was like a tide, always silently washing away his memories over and over again, diluting the pain and blurring the past. It turned out that emotions would eventually fade. Whether it was hatred or love, after a long time, would only an indifferent shadow be left. Lu Chen quietly looked up at the dark sky, staring at the figures of the past in his memory. Then there was a whistling sound, echoing in the dark abyss, and the dark tide surged again. Atsu's body trembled, and it leaned closer to him. Lu Chen hugged its body, and just like yesterday, he bent down to shelter it from the darkness. Atsu quietened down. The darkness roared up. In the darkness of the night, the huge and terrifying black shadow appeared again, violently tearing at the black night and the mountain. When it crossed the mountain peak and roared at the night sky, the earth seemed to tremble because of it. Despite last night's experience, Lu Chen could not help but be shocked by this unusually powerful aura, and subconsciously held his breath. That black shadow was perhaps the king of the night, looking disdainfully in all directions. After roaring, it might have turned around to look for food, but it was also at this moment that the mountains suddenly became silent, and all sounds abruptly returned to silence. The shadow seemed to stop, and suddenly turned around, looking into the distance. Lu Chen seemed to sense something and looked up. At that moment, his heart suddenly beat faster. In the pitch-black night, on the opposite side of the terrifying black shadow, separated by the dark canyon and abyss, another huge shadow slowly appeared on the opposite mountaintop. Lu Chen could not see the outline of the appearance, and could only see the two huge eyes in the darkness, dark green and deep, with an indescribable aura of death. That was a cruel and vicious gaze, as if it wanted to tear everything apart and devour everything. Even when it saw the giant beast of the King of Darkness, it was the same. In his arms, Atsu's body suddenly trembled, and then it raised its head and looked at the shadow above the mountain peak. Chapter 365. Lu Chen felt Atu's strange movements in his arms and was about to look down to see what was wrong. Who knew that at this moment, in the darkness above them, the two terrifying monsters that were hidden in the darkness suddenly let out a deafening roar at the same time. The voice was like a thunderclap. Even though Lu Chen was quite a distance away, he still felt as if his ears were ringing and buzzing. At the same time, under the huge dark sky above, two huge shadows leaped into the sky. In an instant, all the darkness in the world boiled, and the wind and clouds rolled. With a loud bang, they collided with each other in midair. The towering and majestic great snow mountains seemed to tremble violently at this moment. Deafening roars resounded through the sky. The two terrifying beasts who seemed to belong to the darkness fought fiercely. For a moment, the mountains shook and the earth quaked. For Lu Chen and Atsu, this unusually dangerous canyon, including the bottomless abyss underground, was a place where lives could be taken at any time. But for the two terrifying beasts above, perhaps this was just an inconspicuous crack in their eyes. They didn't care about the crack under their feet at all. Just like that, they fought violently on the top of the mountain. Amidst countless roars and roars, hard rocks of all sizes were easily smashed, torn, and fell. Lu Chen and Atsu felt as though it was raining violently. When immortals fight, mortals suffer. This was probably what it meant. Lu Chen and Atsu, who were originally hiding in the cliff path below, were a little dumbfounded. However, there was nowhere for them to escape. Firstly, the size and strength of these two enormous beasts were too enormous. As soon as they started fighting, it instantly affected a wide area of at least a few hundred meters. Rocks rumbled and fell like rain everywhere, and it was similarly extremely dangerous. Another reason was that the night was too dark, and under the circumstances that one couldn't even see one's own fingers in front of one's face. If one wanted to flee for one's life, then how many boulders would fall? This wasn't much different from giving their lives away. But if they stayed where they were, it seemed that the situation wouldn't be any better. Lu Chen only felt that the mountain behind him and under his feet kept shaking and trembling. At the same time, he could even hear the stiff and cold sound of the mountain cracking. Just from the sound alone, he seemed to be able to imagine the many cracks that suddenly appeared on the cliff behind him. Gradually, along with the violent wind, the rocks of all sizes that began to fall from above also began to fall. All the hair on Atsu's body seemed to stand up at that moment. It stood up with a roar and desperately turned its head to look around, as if it was looking for a place to escape. However, it was surrounded by darkness, and it couldn't see any way out. The dog was so anxious that it stomped its feet. Just as it was about to recklessly rush out of the small stone platform, Lu Chen dragged it back from behind and grabbed it tightly. At the same time, he growled, "If you stay here, you'll die if you go out." After being roared at by him, Atsu temporarily calmed down a little, but Lu Chen could still feel the fear from its slightly trembling body. Lu Chen could still be considered calm, but he was also very nervous. He hugged Atsu tightly, and his mind was spinning anxiously, trying to think of a way to avoid this unexpected disaster, when he heard the sound of a boulder falling. It was the rocks that fell from the sky, smashing fiercely on the opposite stone wall. Countless small rocks shot out in all directions, and then fell along with the rocks. The sound of cracking and rumbling echoed through the canyon, and then more and bigger rocks began to fall. In the darkness, countless black shadows could be seen moving crazily, and no one knew what kind of fate awaited them in the next moment. Lu Chen grabbed Atsu tightly and squeezed into the narrow hole with all his strength. At the same time, he curled up his body. Just as he shrank his feet into the hole, he heard a loud bang, and a big rock fell heavily on the small stone platform, directly smashing half of the small stone platform, and then turned into gravel and fell down. Lu Chen and Atsu were dumbfounded. That was the moment when they were abnormally close to death, but at this time, they didn't even have the time to sigh or feel any lingering fear or hope that they might be lucky. Because more and more falling rocks, accompanied by terrifying roars and sounds of fighting, continued to fall. As the earth shook and the mountains shook, countless large and small rocks turned into black shadows and fell one after another. While they were panicking, Lu Chen suddenly felt the wind above their heads. He and Atsu looked up at the same time, only to see a huge black shadow falling from the sky, and it was smashing towards their heads. There was no way to dodge, no place to hide, no way to escape. Lu Chen's pupils constricted, and Atu began to howl madly. In this critical moment, the black shadow continued to smash through the cliffs and boulders, but didn't change course. Instead, it fell faster and faster, as fast as lightning. In the time it takes for a spark to fly off of a piece of flint, Lu Chen finally let out an enraged curse. He held Atu in his arms and pressed a hand to his chest. Black flames burned fiercely in the darkness of the night, then vanished. In an instant, he and Atu suddenly disappeared in this narrow space, and a moment later, a huge rock smashed down. With a loud bang, the platform was smashed into pieces, and then it fell down, straight into the bottomless dark abyss. And in the still deep night, on the majestic and vast snowy mountain, under the boundless dark sky, there was still an earth-shattering battle going on. In the darkness, the kings were fighting, and no one knew what it was for. When a white light flashed in front of them, the bodies of Lu Chen and Atsu fell heavily on the ground in the tree hole. One man and one dog lay on the ground, and neither of them got up immediately. It seemed that they still hadn't woken up from the collapse of the world just now. After a while, their breathing seemed to gradually calm down. Lu Chen was still lying on the ground, and Atsu turned around and stood up. It first looked around. This tree hole, which was no longer unfamiliar to it, made it feel a sense of security. It then wagged its tail, walked to Lu Chen's side, lowered its head, and rubbed its head against his body. Lu Chen slowly sat up. Like Atsu, he also turned his head to look at this familiar tree hole, and then he smiled bitterly. "Oh no, Atsu." He reached out his hand and touched Atsu's head. There was a trace of helplessness on his face, and he said, "We are still forced to come here, and we don't know what's going on outside." Atsu turned its head to look at the mountain of food in the tree hole, and barked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen shook his head, and after a moment of silence, he said, "No, we can't wait too long this time, we have to get out of here as soon as possible." As he spoke, Lu Chen stretched out his hand and picked up a simple wooden hourglass from the ground not far away. He had casually made it when he was still in the Blackfire tribe, so that he could keep track of time in this tree hole where he didn't know the flow of time. He stared at the hourglass for a moment, then turned it upside down on the ground, and said to Atsu, "At most 2 or 3 hours, we have to get out of here." Atsu tilted its head, and seemed to be a little puzzled. Lu Chen sighed and said, "In a few hours, it will be almost dawn. I don't know if the two monsters will continue to fight, and I don't know if the situation outside will be dangerous. But I'm afraid that it will be a disaster. This seed is very likely to fall into that crack." Speaking of this, he smiled bitterly again, as if he was also lamenting the helplessness of fate, and then said, "But, no matter what, we still have to get out because tomorrow is the last sunny day." He looked at Atsu and said, "We are trapped in the canyon. No matter what, tomorrow is the last chance, we have to go." Chapter 366. Time was like the sand in the hourglass on the ground, slowly falling bit by bit, silently passing by. When people knew nothing about the future or the outside world, it took a lot of courage to take that step. For a while, Lu Chen sat quietly, staring at the hourglass without saying a word. Atsu did not seem to be in a frenzy, or perhaps it was not fully aware of the danger of going out this time. It just lay on the ground next to Lu Chen, sticking close to him. However, there was a lot of food here, including its favorite dried meat. It could be seen that Atsu was different from usual. It was quiet in the tree hole, as if it had been like this for a long time, and Lu Chen and the others seemed to be just a small splash in the long river of time. Under all the abnormalities, a small anomaly could not make a big splash. Lu Chen raised his head and looked around the tree hole. He was very familiar with this place. From the first time he found this place, he had been here countless times. This mysterious and ancient tree hole had given him a new life. It had supported him through all kinds of pain that he almost fell into hell, and helped him break free from the terrible curse at the last moment. For so many years, this had been his last haven. When he was in the most painful, desperate, and sad times, only this tree hole would be his only shelter, his last place to escape. For so many years, only Atsu could completely share this secret with him. After leaving this place this time, would there be a chance to come back after leaving this place? Lu Chen was not sure, but he was not unfamiliar with this feeling. He was not even afraid. Many years ago, he had experienced many tests of life and death. He just looked at the tree hole and suddenly remembered the legend he had heard before. Then he looked at the empty tree hole and said to himself, I heard that you have a few companions of the same origin. Yezi? Branches? I don't know when you guys will be together again. The tree hole was silent, as if it had no reaction to his words. However, in the past 10 years, the tree hole had never reacted. Lu Chen naturally wouldn't treat this tree hole as a sentient being. He just casually said that, then closed his eyes and continued to be quiet. Slowly, the sand in the hourglass was about to run out. Time flew by. Atsu squinted his eyes, and Lu Chen leaned against the wall. Everything looked so quiet as if time had stopped. Then, Lu Chen suddenly opened his eyes. Atsu seemed to have sensed something and looked up. Then he saw Lu Chen silently stand up. His face was expressionless as he said in a flat tone, Atsu, let's go. A white light flashed in the air. Like duckweed in a big river, like a glimmer between heaven and earth, like an ant in the world, so small and humble, quietly appeared in this world. After the light passed, Lu Chen and Atsu suddenly appeared in the air. After a moment of pause, their bodies suddenly fell down. It was really a flash of lightning. The world seemed to be still spinning. There were mountains, rocks, wind, clouds, light, and darkness. There was also a strange boundary where light and shadow intertwined. It was like a turbulent wave, rushing from a certain direction. Lu Chen's pupils suddenly dilated at that moment. He suddenly let out a furious roar. The world was spinning upside down, and everything was screaming crazily in his ears. However, he still stubbornly shook off all these terrifying phantoms. His eyes stared at all the terrifying phantoms for a moment. It was the most silent, most solid, and seemingly the farthest stone. Stone wall. That was the stone wall of the mountain. He was roaring. Then he stretched out his hands with all his might and desperately grabbed the stone wall. There was only a series of ear-piercing crashing sounds. The stone cracked and blood flowed. His body was still sliding down. His hands couldn't grab anything, but he desperately grabbed every crack that had the slightest resistance. After sliding down 7 or 8 times, his right hand suddenly grabbed a stone that was firmly protruding out of the wall about half a foot. Hoo! His body suddenly stopped. His whole body weight was supported by his right hand. At this moment, the chaotic and spinning world finally stopped in his eyes and returned to its original appearance. There was a severe pain from his right hand, as if his flesh was torn apart. However, Lu Chen's reaction to this was only a slight frown. Even his expression didn't change much. He just hung alone in the air and gently took a breath. The whole world seemed to slowly become clear at this moment. The sky was bright. There was light falling from the sky above the canyon. The deep night had indeed passed. The precipice path that he was originally staying on was no longer in front of him. After looking carefully, Lu Chen found that the path did not disappear. Instead, it appeared more than 10 feet above his head. In other words, he had fallen from that precipice path and fell more than 10 feet in one breath. Lu Chen subconsciously looked down. He saw that below his feet, the deep and dark place was like a ferocious mouth, as if waiting to swallow him. Lu Chen shook his head. He stretched out his left hand and felt a gap on the stone wall that he could grab. After sharing the burden of his right hand, he let out a sigh of relief. But at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly heard a burst of barking coming from above. Woof, 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 woof. Lu Chen's spirit was lifted. He looked up and saw a huge black dog's head poking out from the high precipice path. It looked around as if it was looking for something. It was Atsu. After a while, Atsu saw Lu Chen hanging at the bottom of the cliff. It suddenly became spirited and barked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen also laughed, then he really laughed. He scolded the black dog that was barking happily, then he smiled and said, "Stupid dog, I didn't expect you to be so good." No matter how anxious Atsu was, although Lu Chen seemed to be in a desperate and dangerous situation at the moment, he was still very calm. After his body climbed to the precipice and stood firmly, he began to try to climb up. Since this mountain was originally called a precipice, it was naturally extremely steep and difficult to climb. However, probably after the earth-shattering monster battle last night, the earth shook and the mountain collapsed. Suddenly, there were countless large and small cracks on the precipice and abruptly cracked rocks, making it much easier to climb than before. Just like this, Lu Chen slowly fumbled along the way, looking for a foothold and a place to hold on to. He climbed up bit by bit, and after half an hour, he actually climbed back to the precipice path. When he let out a long breath and sat on the 2 to 3 feet wide precipice path, Atsu next to him ran over with a joyful cry. It used its head to rub against Lu Chen's body, looking very excited. Lu Chen laughed and hugged Atsu's neck. He also patted Atsu's head lightly. "It's not easy, I survived again this time," Lu Chen murmured. Atsu raised its head and looked very happy. Just when it was about to bark at Lu Chen, its eyes suddenly flashed with a green light. It saw the precipice path behind Lu Chen more than 20 feet away. That place was originally also a precipice. Suddenly, another arm stretched out from beneath the rock, and then tightly grabbed onto the edge of the small path. Chapter 367. That was a hand. However, it did not look like a human hand. The black dog could tell at a glance, but to be on the safe side, or perhaps it wanted to make a comparison, it lowered its head and glanced at Lu Chen's palm. One was a hand of flesh and blood, with rosy, lustrous skin, and full of vitality, while the other was not. The palm that suddenly appeared on the edge of the cliff path was gray, cold, hard, and solid. It looked like a rock, but compared to a real rock, there seemed to be something strange about this hand. The rock-like palm abruptly tightened its grip, just like how Lu Chen had done all he could to climb up from the bottom of the cliff. Then, even more gray appeared. Several sharp thorns grew out of the slender arm, and there were also black webbed membranes growing on the underside of his ribs. Soon, a strange and ear-piercing scream came from the bottom of the cliff. It was like a bloodthirsty monster slowly revealing its fangs. Atsu stared at the hand, and the hair on its neck slowly stood up. Then, it suddenly let out a low roar, as if it was facing a formidable enemy. Lu Chen was startled. Then, as if he felt something, he suddenly turned around and saw the scene that Atsu saw just now. Then, under their astonished gazes, the gray shadow in that place swayed, and a head that was smaller than what they had expected was raised from under the rock. At first glance, it looked like an evil spirit. It was a ferocious and ugly head, with sharp fangs protruding from its bloody mouth. Its bell-like eyes were exceptionally large, and the skin on its face was as hard as stone. Even the roar of this monster sounded like a pile of rocks squeezed together and rubbed against each other. When this strange and terrifying monster appeared, it immediately stared at Lu Chen and Atsu, then opened its mouth and roared at them. Following this fierce roar, a pair of black membranous wings suddenly spread out behind it. There were countless thorns on the wings, and there were several sharp claws on the edge of the wings. The sharp claws even reflected a white light. Lu Chen's face darkened. He didn't recognize this monster. He hadn't even heard of it before, let alone seen it. He suspected that this strange monster, which looked like a giant stone bat, only existed in the Great Snow Mountain. Otherwise, it would be impossible for there to be no records of it in the world for thousands of years. But it was meaningless to think about these things now, because the monster had already soared into the air, flapped its huge membranous wings, and then pounced on him. At that moment, the sky seemed to darken a little. The monster opened its mouth and bared its fangs. It was so aggressive that it looked like it wanted to eat meat and drink blood. In any case, it didn't look like it wanted to make friends. Lu Chen had no choice at all. He stood up abruptly and waved his hand. At the same time, a black dagger suddenly appeared in his hand. Black flames ignited and condensed into a half-foot-long flame that stabbed towards the monster that was pouncing towards him. Almost immediately, Lu Chen used his greatest power. This was because he knew nothing about this kind of monster, and because he suddenly felt a trace of danger from the depths of his heart. The monster that looked like a giant bat pounced over, and its sharp claws were in front of him in the blink of an eye. Lu Chen dodged to the side, but the black dagger in his hand didn't stop. It continued to pierce forward and directly stabbed the only soft membrane of the monster. This time, Lu Chen felt as if he had stabbed an incomparably hard rock. He could even see sparks flying out from the friction between the sharp blade and the rock. His arm violently shook. The incomparably sharp blade, the killing weapon that had killed many people and pierced through many flesh, was forcibly blocked just like that. But at the same time, the black flames in front of the black dagger seemed to be unaffected by the monster's hard skin and directly penetrated it, burning into the membrane. In a moment, under the incomparably hard skin, a terrifying blood bag bulged, and the strange blood inside seemed to boil and burn in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint. Then, with a boom, it exploded. Blood splattered everywhere, and the color of the blood was impressively black. The monster's head suddenly rose, and it let out an incomparably mournful scream. Its wings desperately flapped, and then it seemed to flap its wings to fly up. However, the membrane that was pierced by Lu Chen's black dagger was obviously flapping very hard, and it seemed to be seriously injured. Lu Chen leaned against the rock, clinging to the mountain wall, holding the dagger in his hand, and stared coldly at the monster in the air above the cliff not far away. Beside him, Atsu also pounced over, roaring loudly at the monster in the air, and also fiercely bared its fangs. The ferocity in the monster's eyes didn't fade at all. Instead, it looked at the two living creatures below even more viciously, but there was still a touch of fear in its eyes. So after a moment, it suddenly flapped its wings and flew back for a distance. Then it let out a shrill cry towards the dark bottomless abyss below. Squeak! The shrill cry instantly spread, echoing in this narrow and long canyon between the mountains and also in the dark crevice. Lu Chen's heart tightened, and his expression changed slightly. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly heard a burst of strange sounds from the depths of the dark crevice under his feet. After a moment, the world seemed to suddenly turn dark, and the sound of something flapping in the air suddenly sounded. One after another, black shadows pounced out from the depths of the darkness. 1, 2, 3, a dozen, dozens, and even more similar monsters flapped their huge membranous wings and flew out from the depths of the ground, flocking here from all directions. Lu Chen's heart sank, and Atsu's cry was also interrupted. However, in the roar not long after, they were surrounded by a large black mass of monsters from top to bottom, from front to back. And further away in their line of sight, there seemed to be more monsters rushing over. That scene was like the end of the underworld. Every pair of eyes revealed greed and desire for flesh and blood, and every monster looked extremely bloodthirsty. No one knew which one was the first to lose its patience, but with a shrill cry, it swooped down from midair. Lu Chen, who had cold sweat on his forehead, swung his sword. The monster seemed to know that the dagger was extremely dangerous. It screamed and flapped its wings to avoid it, but its sharp claws scratched the stone wall above Lu Chen's head, instantly tearing the mountain rocks, leaving a few slender cracks, and small stones fell one after another. This action seemed to have suddenly opened the prelude to the siege. All the monsters screamed desperately, crowded in midair, and were about to pounce on Lu Chen. At this critical moment, Lu Chen could no longer care about anything else. He clenched his teeth and directly jumped onto Atsu's back. Then, on this narrow mountain path on this precipice, Lu Chen did not even look at Atsu. He didn't even look at Atu, only growling in a low voice, "Charge!" Atu let out a furious roar and sprinted forward. And all the monsters in midair seemed to be completely enraged at this moment. Countless strange screams were deafening, countless sharp claws and terrifying membranous wings swarmed over, biting and biting from every direction. From afar, it looked like a terrifying black ball that kept squirming in the darkness, running rapidly on the precipice path. Chapter 368. Countless membrane-winged bats were hovering in the air, crowded together. They seemed to be crowded, but strangely, they never collided with each other, always passing each other by a hair's breadth. Accompanied by countless terrifying and ear-piercing screeches, The demon beasts with bloodthirsty red eyes swooped down ceaselessly. They stretched out their sharp claws and flapped their wings as they desperately clawed at Atu and Lu Chen. They were like a pack of hungry wolves about to tear apart fresh food. However, this food was not dead yet, nor was it frightened by this terrifying scene. Lu Chen no longer looked at the incomparably dangerous precipice under his feet. It was as if he had placed his life completely in Atu's hands. He clenched the black dagger in his hand, struggling to parry and resist the monsters that kept attacking from above, below, left and right. In just a short moment, Lu Chen had discovered that these membrane-winged bat monsters, which he had never heard of before, were extremely powerful. Almost all of his own means did not have much effect on them. Only the power of the black fire seemed to be the natural enemy of these monsters. It could repeatedly disrupt their formation in the chaos, and once it came into contact with the skin and flesh of these monsters, it could immediately burn in and seriously injure them. Not long after, these bloodthirsty and crazy monsters seemed to have understood. They began to fear the black dagger in Lu Chen's hand, especially the black flame that rose from the dagger from time to time. Often, when Lu Chen stabbed with the dagger, the membrane-winged bat monsters in front of him would scream and flap their wings to fly away. In this way, Lu Chen could no longer hurt these monsters as easily as he did at the beginning, but with this layer of fear, these membrane-winged bats did not dare to easily attack. But from the beginning to the end, none of these strange and terrible monsters left. They were still circling around Lu Chen and Atsu, chasing them in the air, screaming and looking for any opportunity to suddenly rush down to attack. At the same time, Atsu seemed to have completely forgotten everything around it. Just like Lu Chen suddenly no longer cared about the things under his feet, and gave his life to this big black dog that could not speak, Atsu also no longer looked up. Those terrible monsters, sharp roars, bloodthirsty eyes, and sharp claws that could tear its body apart, all turned a blind eye to them. The black dog just barked and howled, then ran forward wildly. The cliff path was extremely dangerous, and many places were abnormally narrow. Some sections had even been broken after the accident last night. However, Atsu still rushed forward all the way without looking back. Its body, its movements, were so agile that it was stunning. Like a flash of lightning, or like the most agile ape in the forest, it kept jumping and running in this natural barrier as if it was running on flat ground. It was only because the surrounding membrane-winged bats were all flying monsters that they could keep up with it. Otherwise, they would have been left behind by Atsu a long time ago. It seemed to trust the man on its back wholeheartedly, ignoring all the other demonic beasts and trusting that Lu Chen would be able to protect it. The man and the dog suddenly had such a tacit understanding in the face of life and death. However, the situation was still dangerous. The membrane-winged bats were powerful, numerous, and extremely fast. If it were other beasts, they would have long become food in their stomachs, or lost their footing and fell off the cliff. It could be said to be a miracle that Lu Chen and Atsu were able to hold on until now. But in such a situation, those countless membrane-winged bats still showed no signs of giving up. Under their incessant harassment and attacks, Atsu seemed to be able to hold on as he ran with all his heart, but Lu Chen's complexion gradually turned ashen and unsightly after continuously resisting the numerous demon beasts' attacks without a moment's pause. The spiritual power in his body began to dry up. The dark flame on his black dagger was getting fainter and fainter, and the flame was getting shorter and shorter. As he gradually showed signs of weakness, the surrounding membrane-winged bats suddenly became excited. Their shrill cries became louder and louder, and their blood-red eyes seemed to glow. Their attacks suddenly became even more frenzied, as if these demonic beasts were actually quite intelligent. The great snow mountain, after all, still had an irresistible danger that was almost irresistible. The black ball formed by the membrane-winged bats was getting closer and closer, and the shrieking demon beasts were getting closer and closer with every pounce. The crushed stone walls were sent flying, and the debris kept falling, as if foreshadowing the arrival of the final desperate situation. At this increasingly critical moment, suddenly, Lu Chen heard Atsu under him suddenly let out a long howl, which was not quite the same as its previous barking, and even contained a hint of surprise. He tried his best to stab with his dagger, avoiding a membrane-winged bat that had just rushed over. Taking advantage of the short moment of respite, he suddenly looked back, and his eyes suddenly lit up. He saw that a piece of flat ground suddenly appeared in front of him. This unusually long and dangerous canyon had finally come to an end. The snow-covered ground looked as dazzling as a piece of white jade. Lu Chen's spirit was greatly boosted. Although he did not know how to get rid of these terrible membrane-winged bats for the time being, it was always a good thing to have a change. Otherwise, he, who was almost at the end of his strength, really did not have the confidence to last long on this dangerous precipice trail. "Rush over!" Lu Chen roared to Atsu. However, almost at the same time, those membrane-winged bats seemed to have felt something, and their offensive suddenly increased, screaming and pouncing madly, several times more ferocious than before. Suddenly, Lu Chen was left and right, and he almost couldn't hold on any longer. Sure enough, after a moment, there was a low hiss, and Lu Chen let out a muffled groan. His body shook violently, but after persisting for a long time, his movements were finally a beat slower. Soon, the slight decline immediately brought serious consequences. A huge membrane-winged bat waved its sharp claws and pounced over. The claws swept past Lu Chen's shoulder, and in an instant, blood appeared. The skin was torn open, and a large piece of flesh was forcibly torn off, blood splattering everywhere. Lu Chen took a deep breath, and his face turned pale. Perhaps it was because they saw and smelled the smell of blood. All the membrane-winged bats around instantly became excited and pounced down together, screaming wildly. The scene was like a black ball suddenly collapsing, concave towards the center. At this moment of life and death, Atsu also seemed to feel the danger. With a fierce howl, it suddenly jumped up in the midst of running, rushing over the canyon in a dangerous gap, and fell heavily on the snowy ground. It also temporarily escaped the attack of those membrane-winged bats. There was a series of strange rumbling sounds behind him, and at that moment, countless membrane-winged bats could not stop their momentum and crashed into the stone wall. For a time, strange whistling sounds rose one after another, and in the blink of an eye, there were countless more scars on the mountain wall. But it didn't take long for those membrane-winged bats to flap their wings and fly again. Under the gaze of Lu Chen and Atsu, they seemed to be not bound by the canyon at all, or perhaps the smell of blood on Lu Chen's shoulder had made them dizzy, and they desperately wanted to kill and eat these two living creatures. At that moment, a black shadow seemed to cover the sky and the earth, shrouding the snowy ground. Lu Chen and Atsu fell on the snowy ground, and a black shadow covered their eyes. But before they could react, a huge figure suddenly rushed out from behind a mountain wall next to them, and directly crashed into the seemingly terrifying flock of membrane-winged bats. "Gotcha!" It was an ear-piercing sound that carried a trace of terror and cruelty. All the membrane-winged bats seemed to freeze in an instant, and a bloody mouth suddenly appeared in midair, biting down from the air, and directly biting 3 membrane-winged bats in its mouth. The sharp teeth closed, and the giant turned around. Black blood flowed out from the gaps between the terrifying giant teeth like water, and slowly dripped down from the mouth of the giant beast. Then, there was a chewing sound coming from the huge shadow, making their hands and feet turn cold. The residual shadow coldly and slowly turned to look at them. The black shadow was like a mountain, completely enveloping them. Chapter 369. The numerous membrane wingbats, which were still arrogant and majestic just a moment ago, suddenly disappeared. Even if these ferocious demon beasts saw with their own eyes that their companions were suddenly bitten and bleeding by the giant mouth, none of the membrane wingbats showed any signs of revenge. All the membrane wingbats seemed to have suddenly turned into stone and were frozen in the air. Those sharp, ear-piercing, bloodthirsty howls also suddenly fell silent at this moment. For a moment, Lu Chen and Atsu, who had fallen on the snow, did not make a sound, nor did the numerous membrane wingbats in the air. Only the mountain-like majestic black shadow, with its huge mouth, gave off a shuddering and terrifying chewing sound. Crunch, crunch. It was the sound of fangs and bones rubbing against each other. Blood flowed and slowly dripped down. The next moment, all the membrane wing bats seemed to have woken up from a dream. In an instant, strange cries rang out. They seemed to have suddenly woken up and fluttered their wings to fly into the sky in horror. They seemed to desperately want to leave this place, to get away from the huge black shadow. The further the better. A giant claw descended from the sky, and with a sharp whistling sound, it directly smashed into the group of membrane wing bats. In an instant, there was a burst of chaotic banging sounds mixed with screams. Another 7 or 8 unlucky membrane wing bats were smashed by this giant claw, and as if struck by lightning, they fell from the sky one after another. Lu Chen and Atsu saw it clearly from the side. They saw that the membrane wing bats that fell had broken bones and tendons. Before they fell to the ground, they could see that their bodies were strangely twisted. After falling to the ground, after struggling a few times on the snow, they all became stiff and motionless. It seemed that they had already died. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the remaining membrane wing bats desperately flapped their wings and flew far away, as if they were fleeing for their lives. One by one, they rushed back to the canyon and dove into the bottomless, dark crevice at the fastest speed, disappearing in the blink of an eye. It was quiet outside the canyon. There was only an unusually tall figure standing in the snow, with its back facing them. At this moment, even Lu Chen and Atsu did not dare to move rashly, for fear that they would suddenly alarm or anger this terrifying monster. At this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt a chill on his face. He reached out to touch his cheek and found that it was slightly wet. He then looked up and saw that between the blue sky and the snow-capped mountains, there were faint and tiny specks of white floating down. A gust of wind blew from afar, bringing with it a slight chill. It began to snow again. The snow was not heavy, and the wind was very light. It was probably just the beginning. For Lu Chen and Atsu, who were lying on the snowy ground, none of this was important at the moment. Their attention was focused on the gigantic monster in front of them. Lu Chen was a little nervous. For such a monster that could easily scare away those membrane wing bats and even treat them as food, the strength of Lu Chen and Atsu could not resist it at all. The only thing they could do was probably to see if they could find a chance to escape. Just as he was thinking about how to find a chance to escape, Atsu, who was originally lying beside him, suddenly stood up. Lu Chen was taken aback and quickly reached out to pull Atsu. He had not seen the true face of the monster in front of him, but there was no doubt that the monster was powerful and terrifying. He was a little worried that Atsu was too frightened and would react excessively. If he provoked the monster in advance, he was afraid that it would immediately be a disaster. However, it seemed that Atsu just stood up. The appearance of this black dog also looked a little strange. It seemed to be a little confused, but also a little excited. It stared at the huge shadow, and even its breathing became a lot heavier. Although he was a little surprised by Atsu's performance, seeing that Atsu did not make any drastic moves for the time being, Lu Chen was still relieved. Only then did he turn his attention back to the giant monster. After the membrane wing bats fled, the giant monster that suddenly appeared turned its head and looked in the direction of the dark crack in the canyon. It did not have any intention to chase after them. After a while, it turned its head, then took 2 steps forward and came to the corpses of the membrane wing bats that were shot down on the snow. It lowered its head and began to chew. It was also at this moment that Lu Chen finally saw the appearance of the giant monster. He was shocked. The giant monster that appeared in front of him was impressively a giant wolf with an unusually large body. In that canyon, there once appeared a giant wolf with the corpses of humans in its mouth. This paragraph suddenly came to Lu Chen's mind. That was what Hui Yen said to him back then, and it was also the biggest basis for them to determine that there might be a secret path to the northern human territory here. Lu Chen had never seen such a huge monster wolf in his life. Even after Atsu had advanced, it was far inferior to this giant wolf. At best, the body of Atsu was only 1/5 the size of this giant wolf. Its fur was grayish-white, and it had sharp teeth. At this moment, this giant wolf did not seem to notice that there were 2 living creatures in the snow. It just lowered its head and gnawed on the membrane wing bats that it had shot down. It ate happily, and the sound of crunching that made people's scalp tingle was endless. Seeing the appearance of this giant wolf monster beast, a glimmer of hope suddenly appeared in Lu Chen's heart. He slowly stood up from the snow, and then pulled Atsu, preparing to take this opportunity to try and sneak away quietly. Unexpectedly, Atsu did not move at all, and it did not have the obedience that it usually had towards him. This black dog just stared at the giant wolf. Not only did it not leave, but it even took a step towards the giant wolf. Lu Chen was taken aback and quickly reached out to grab the fur on Atsu's back, not letting it go any further. But just these few actions, coupled with Atsu's subconscious struggle, suddenly seemed to have alarmed the giant wolf monster over there. It suddenly raised its head and looked in the direction of Lu Chen and Atsu. It was a pair of deep green giant eyes, with a cold aura that seemed to be unique to the great snowy mountain. It instantly enveloped Lu Chen and Atsu. A chill made the two of them shiver uncontrollably. For a moment, Lu Chen wanted to grab Atsu and run away, but in the end he forcibly endured it. How to put it, in the face of such a monster, the hope of escaping was really not big. On the contrary, it was better not to further provoke it for the time being. After all, this giant wolf monster did not directly attack them like it did those membrane-winged bats. Although this monster was too terrifying and difficult to predict, it was better to keep quiet. But Atsu seemed to be particularly strange today, different from the past. Under such heavy pressure, not only did it not retreat, but after hesitating for a while, it actually walked towards the monster again. And this time, Atsu did not even stop, and actually walked straight towards it. Lu Chen was stunned. He reached out to grab it, but he could not. At such a dangerous and shocking juncture, he could only watch Atsu walk past. Slowly, with a hint of a test, and at the same time, under the cold gaze of the giant beast, Atsu slowly walked to the feet of the giant wolf. Its body was a little trembling, as if it was still a little afraid, but there was still a stronger force driving it. The giant wolf looked at this little thing coldly, and did not seem to have any intention of making a move. Watching from a distance, Lu Chen, who had no time to stop it, was suddenly shocked. He only felt that Atsu and the giant wolf monster were vaguely similar. Chapter 370. Atsu used to be a stray dog. It met Lu Chen and Xianxia in the land of chaos and was adopted. Since then, it had been by Lu Chen's side. Xianxia had always liked it, but for some reason, Atsu was determined to follow Lu Chen, which made Xianxia very sad. After living together for so many years, they had almost never been separated. Lu Chen naturally knew Atsu's situation like the back of his hand. From the time it was a puppy until it grew into a big dog, Atsu had always been a rustic dog. That was how it got its name. It could be considered a joke that Lu Chen had made fun of it in the past. However, after the Battle of Kunlun Mountain, Atsu, with a combination of all kinds of opportunities, stimulated the ancient bloodline in its body and obtained the opportunity to advance. When Lu Chen saw Atsu again, this puppy had undergone a great change in appearance. It had become more like a powerful black wolf monster. Yes, now, although Lu Chen usually called Atsu as a stupid dog, and so on, even when he was joking, Atsu was already a wolf. At this moment, there was a similarly terrifying and inconceivable giant wolf demonic beast in front of it. Lu Chen even felt that although there was a big difference in size between Atsu and this giant wolf monster, Atsu looked very much like this giant wolf, as if this giant wolf had shrunk by 4 or 5 times. Obviously, Lu Chen was not the only one who felt this way. The two wolves, one big and one small, also seemed to have noticed something. Atsu looked very nervous, and Lu Chen could even see its body trembling slightly on the snowy ground. But in Atsu's heart, there seemed to be another particularly strong emotion driving it all the way to the front of the giant wolf demon beast. It raised its head and looked up at the giant wolf. The giant wolf looked down at it indifferently. After a while, Atsu suddenly let out a howl. It sounded like a wolf's howl, and it reverberated through the mountains. Lu Chen didn't know what Atsu meant by this howl, but he still subconsciously became nervous. This was because he saw that after Atsu mustered up the courage to howl, the giant wolf demon beast finally responded. It suddenly raised one of its front claws. It was the giant claw that had killed 7 or 8 ferocious membrane-wing bats in an instant, and then it slammed down towards Atsu. The wind on the snow-capped mountain seemed to have suddenly turned cold, so cold that it froze one's blood. Lu Chen only felt his scalp go numb, and his heart suddenly jumped. But soon he found something unusual. The giant wolf demon beast's claws were not fast. For a giant beast like it could even be said to be gentle. Lu Chen abruptly stopped his steps and stared at the giant beast in front of him. It was at this moment, following the movement of the giant wolf demon beast, Lu Chen suddenly discovered some details that he hadn't noticed before. This giant wolf demon beast was undoubtedly terrifying and powerful, but at this moment, Lu Chen discovered that there were wounds on the giant wolf's body. The wounds were very deep, and the injuries were very serious. There were even more than one wound. Although this giant wolf demon beast didn't seem to care about the injuries on its body, Lu Chen quickly thought of the big fight that he had experienced not long ago. To be precise, it was last night in that canyon, where he was forced to hide in the seed tree hole. Just as Lu Chen's expression changed slightly, the wolf's claws in the air had already fallen and landed on the top of Atsu's head. Atsu lowered its head and body, seemingly making a submissive posture. The giant wolf's claws did not show the terrifying power that it had before to directly kill it. Instead, after a slight pause, it actually gently touched the top of Atsu's head twice. A low and heavy voice suddenly echoed in this snow-capped mountain. "You are my son." The mountains were silent, and the snow seemed to be a little stronger. There was no one else here except for Lu Chen. There were only 2 wolves in front of him. But this heavy voice also clearly echoed in Lu Chen's ears, causing him to be a little confused for a moment. But very soon, he came to his senses and looked at the giant wolf demon beast with a stunned expression. After Atsu heard this, he became visibly excited. He barked a few times at the giant wolf monstrous beast. His body kept twisting, and from time to time, he would rub his head against the giant wolf monstrous beast, expressing his obvious affection. Looking at the strange behavior of Atsu, Lu Chen instantly thought of the reason for this matter. When he first saw Atsu, he judged that this little demon beast might have an extraordinary origin, and it was even likely to be a descendant of the legendary snow wolf demon beast of the Great Snowy Mountain. The snow wolf, also known as the Heavenly Wolf, was one of the most powerful and terrifying demon beasts in the ancient times, and had unimaginable power. But for some reason unknown to the human race, this powerful demon beast had never appeared in the world in the history of the human race, but its legend had always existed. Looking at the giant wolf demon beast in front of him, Lu Chen took a deep breath. No wonder it could fight head-on with the King of Darkness in the underground abyss. They were indeed powerful creatures that defied the natural order. As for Atsu, since it was a descendant of the Heavenly Wolf and had wandered to the chaotic lands, Lu Chen did not know about it. But according to the legend, the Heavenly Wolf was a loner and did not care about having children. Perhaps even the Heavenly Wolf itself did not know about the existence of Atsu. In short, Atsu seemed to be extremely excited. When the Heavenly Wolf saw one of its children suddenly appear in front of it, it seemed to be in a good mood. After a while, it turned its gaze to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat, but before he or the Heavenly Wolf could react, Atsu had already jumped in between them, stopped Lu Chen, and barked at the Heavenly Wolf. After listening for a while, the Heavenly Wolf's originally cold gaze softened. It retracted its gaze, opened and closed its mouth, and a deep and heavy voice once again came from its mouth. "Since you said so, I'll spare his life. Human, go down the mountain yourself." Lu Chen was shocked, and his heart was at a loss for a moment. But he knew that this was probably the best outcome for him. But at this moment, Atsu suddenly jumped up again, barked repeatedly, and ran back to Lu Chen's side. The Heavenly Wolf's voice suddenly carried a trace of anger, and said, "You are a descendant of the Heavenly Wolf. Why are you following a human?" After a pause, it said again, "Stay in this great snow mountain and stay by my side for a few years. I will naturally teach you various skills so that you can achieve something in the future." However, Atsu just shook its head, and its expression was extremely firm. The intimacy it had when it first saw the Heavenly Wolf had disappeared at this moment. Lu Chen was surprised and a little touched. For a moment, he did not know what to say, but he looked at the heavenly wolf with some worry, afraid that it would get angry. However, the heavenly wolf just stared at Atsu, and after a long while, it shook its head, seemingly a little helpless, and said in a low voice, "Sure enough, our heavenly wolf bloodline is..." It did not continue speaking, but took a step and walked towards Lu Chen. The figure, which was as tall as a mountain, walked in front of Lu Chen in a few strides, and a terrible and terrifying pressure instantly shrouded Lu Chen, and the huge wolf's head also slowly lowered and fell in front of Lu Chen. Its sharp and huge fangs were very close to him, and he could even see his own reflection in the terrifying wolf's eyes. But after taking a deep breath, Lu Chen still clenched his teeth and did not retreat. Lu Chen looked straight at the heavenly wolf, and after looking at it for a while, the heavenly wolf suddenly said, "It wants to go with you." Lu Chen nodded and said, "I know, I'm very happy." The heavenly wolf snorted coldly, looked at him and said, "There are countless dangers in front of the Great Snow Mountain. Even if you pass the Abyss Canyon, you can't get out." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and said, "Since we have come this far, we still have to try to know." The heavenly wolf said indifferently, "I can help you pass even if it is for my son, but you are not, so you have to promise to do something for me." Lu Chen's spirit was lifted and he said, "What is it?" The heavenly wolf said, "Have you heard of a person called Taihu? You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.